Today's episode is a fan favorite. It's called Love Makes You Do Crazy Things. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. In 1996, an 18-year-old college freshman named Diane began acting strangely. She would suddenly break down and start crying hysterically, and then a second later, she'd get extremely mad, and then a second after that, she'd be fine again, as if nothing had happened. For a while, her classmates thought her erratic behavior must be tied to her just really missing her boyfriend, who went to another school. But when Diane's classmates finally approached her and asked her what was going on, she gave them an answer that at first sounded so unbelievable, they assumed it had to be a joke. But Diane wasn't joking, and she had the scars to prove it. Horrified, Diane's classmates left her bedroom and ran to tell school staff. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please ask to borrow the Amazon Music Follow Button's phone to make a quick call, but instead of making a quick call, just log onto their Facebook and change their relationship status from married to it's complicated. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the fall of 1995, you would never know by looking at 17-year-old Diane Zamora that this high school senior from Crowley, Texas, had just made one of the most meaningful and important decisions of her young life. In fact, Diane, dressed in her modest t-shirt and plaid miniskirt and standing quietly in front of her locker at the end of the school day, drew a lot less attention to herself than many of the other teenagers who were now spilling into the noisy hallway all around her. But spinning the numbers on her combination lock, Diane did not feel ordinary. Ever since she had started going out with David Graham 2.5 months earlier, it was like Diane's carefully ordered world had suddenly been knocked into a new orbit. As Diane heard the click of the combination lock release, she tucked her chin down and let her dark curly hair fall forward so it covered her face, giving herself a minute of privacy to think about all that had happened starting back in the hot and sunny month of August when she and David had first become a couple. There was that moment when both of them looked across the room at one another, and Diane had suddenly felt like they were the only two people in the whole world. And then when David had walked over and casually touched her shoulder, Diane had felt this amazing thrill as she realized this person who she had known for years as just a friend had suddenly become something so much more. At first, the feelings that Diane had for David were almost as confusing as they were exciting. Up until that point in her life, having a boyfriend had never been part of Diane's life plan. Diane had spent most of her time over the last 3 years carving out a name for herself as a high academic achiever. Her classmates liked her just fine, but they never expected to see her out drinking or run into her at parties. Instead, Diane was known as a friendly but quiet person who put all of her energy into her schoolwork and other activities that might bolster her academic resume. And that effort and focus had already helped her rack up an impressive list of accomplishments. She had been elected to serve in the student government, she played the flute in the school's marching band, she was a member of the community service organization called Key Club, and she was a member of the National Honor Society, an invitation-only organization made up of academically outstanding high schoolers. And for Diane, all her dedication and hard work had a single purpose. From the time she was 9 years old, Diane had one dream in life. She wanted to be an astronaut. In the 4th grade, she had sent a letter to NASA, which is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, asking for brochures about their space program and what it took to become an astronaut. And in the years since, her focus on that ambition had never wavered. That is, until now. Almost unconsciously, Diane looked down at her left hand. It was still wrapped in bandages. Back in September, Diane had been driving David's pickup truck on a dark back road when she got into an accident. The truck had flipped over and crushed some of the bones in her left hand. And during the whole time she'd been laid up in the hospital, David had been there for her. And he was there afterward, too, when Diane was back home, struggling with her schoolwork and with the temptation to take too much of her pain medication. Now, standing in the hallway of her high school, Diane wiggled the ring finger of her left hand. Soon the bones would be fully healed and the swelling would go down. And then Diane, feeling her heart start to race, she could start wearing the diamond ring that David had just bought for her. Because, despite having only been dating for 4 weeks, David had recently asked Diane to marry him. And Diane had not hesitated even a second before she said yes. Their wedding date was already set, but it was almost 5 years in the future, August 13th, 2000. They chose this date because it would be when both of them had graduated from college. But even though getting engaged was a big decision for Diane, it wasn't that decision that made Diane feel so different and so special. For Diane, the very meaningful and important decision she had made so very, very recently was to give up her virginity to David. As Diane started packing books into her backpack, she reminded herself that while it had been a very big decision, it had been the right decision. Meanwhile, 18 miles to the west in Mansfield, Texas, Diane's fiance, David Graham, was also standing in front of his high school locker, and he too was packing the stuff he would need to study that night into his backpack. Like Diane, David was known in his high school for his academic accomplishments, and he was also known for his military ambitions. Even now, at the end of a long day, and with cross-country practice still ahead of him, all 6 feet 2 inches of David's lean body stood ramrod straight. And when a fellow senior heading down the crowded hallway yelled out, "Sup, Colonel Graham?" David just grinned and raised a hand to his forehead in mock salute. He was not one of those aggressive G.I. Joe soldier types. In fact, David had given up football because it just seemed needlessly rough, and he'd taken up cross-country instead. Like Diane at Crowley High School, David was not a part of the in-crowd social scene at his high school. But despite the teasing about his membership in the Junior ROTC and the Junior Civil Air Patrol, David was still known as a pretty cool guy, and an all-around extremely high achiever with exceptionally good manners. Junior ROTC is the U.S. Army's high school equivalent of the Reserve Officer Training Corps, where students who are interested in a military career learn the core values of discipline, citizenship, leadership, character, and community service. And while David was a Junior ROTC battalion commander, his real passion and commitment lay with the Junior Civil Air Patrol. This was a program supported by the U.S. Air Force that also trained teenagers for a military career, with an emphasis on flying and running search and rescue operations. But unlike ROTC, which is geared toward high school students, the Junior Civil Air Patrol accepts teenagers as young as 12 years old, which is how old David was when he first joined. Because like Diane, David had always had one ambition in his life. Ever since first grade, when his dad had taken David to a local air show where the public can go to see different kinds of aircraft and watch amazing displays of aerial acrobatics, David had instantly become obsessed and knew that someday he would become a pilot. And also like Diane, David's dream had only strengthened with each passing year. By the time he was 14, he had his pilot's license, and now, as David headed into his last year of high school, his excellent grades, character references, and junior military service made it a sure bet that after high school, he would be accepted into the prestigious U.S. Air Force Academy out in Colorado Springs, Colorado. As David exchanged a few more greetings with friends and other ROTC members, he also reached into his locker to grab the duffel bag where he kept his cross-country running gear. But instead of going to practice, what David really wanted to do right then was hop in his car and drive out to see Diane in Crowley. But he knew he couldn't. Leaving his school in a tide of other teenagers, David thought back to that evening in early August at a Civil Air Patrol meeting. Like David, Diane had joined the Civil Air Patrol years ago at the age of 14 because she knew that the military was a good way to get the training and qualifications she would need to become an astronaut. But in the first 4 years she had been a member alongside David, the two of them had only been friends, nothing more. But on that particular Tuesday night last August, David just happened to glance over at Diane as she just happened to be glancing over at him, and in this brief moment, they locked eyes, and they both instantly felt attracted to the other. David would later tell his friends that it was like he suddenly saw Diane for what she really was. Incredibly smart, funny, principled, and gorgeous with her dark eyes, full lips, and olive skin. Not that David's fellow cadets needed any telling. they could see right away that something had changed, because that very night, David broke one of the first rules of the Civil Air Patrol Command. As a senior commander in the Civil Air Patrol, David was forbidden to associate with junior cadets, let alone start a romantic relationship with one. But after randomly locking eyes with Diane, David had walked right over to her, put his hand on her shoulder, and then leaned down, and with his mouth pressed close to her ear, he told her she looked very nice tonight. Because of his romantic involvement with Diane, David had to give up his command position in the Civil Air Patrol. But for David, that was a small price to pay in order to be with Diane. And by the end of that month, David was head over heels in love with her. It didn't bother him at all that there was no sex in their relationship, because he respected Diane's views on premarital sex. And even after they got engaged to be married, David had no expectations that Diane's views on sex would suddenly change. However, they did. Diane's horrible accident in his pickup truck had cemented the bond between them. And for David, who had only ever had just one serious girlfriend, Diane's sudden decision to make love to him had led to one of the best experiences in his life. David also knew that their relationship had helped both of them cope with some very painful and difficult family problems. This past summer, David and his 3 siblings were shocked and devastated when their parents divorced, and David's mother had been the one to leave home and move away 250 miles south to Houston, Texas. And it was during that same time that Diane had been the one in her family to confront her father about his longtime affair with his mistress. That affair had created so much financial and emotional chaos in the family that her father had lost his job, and for a short but awful period in her life, Diane and her younger sister and brothers became homeless, living out of the family car. But through it all, Diane and David had been there for one another. David had helped pay Diane's expenses, he gave her rides and bought her clothes, and when Diane's family was back on their feet, David practically began living in their new house. And as soon as cross-country practice was over that afternoon, that's exactly where David was headed, to Diane's house, where they would study together until it was dark, and David's father called to tell David it was time for him to come home. When David arrived in Crowley 2.5 hours later, Diane was waiting for him. She gave him one of her big shy smiles, and a few minutes later they were both seated on her worn sofa, their school books spread out all around them. As David drove back home that night in the dark, he reminded himself that the cross-country season would be over in just a month or so. Mansfield High School's team had been good enough that they'd qualified for the regional meet that would be held in Lubbock, Texas on November 3rd and 4th. But David was not really looking forward to this meet. He had no chance of placing in any of the events. He'd have to stay overnight with his teammates in a cramped motel room. Lubbock was more than 300 miles away, and since Diane's high school, Crowley High School, had not qualified for the regional meet, Diane would be staying home. David had friends on his team that he could spend time with during the meet, but he wished Diane was going to be there. A few weeks later, and the regional meet in Lubbock, Texas wound up happening pretty much as David had expected. But at least when it was all over, David and Diane had more time they could spend together. From that Thanksgiving onward, David and Diane's respective families both watched with pride as the young couple seemed to turn the last 7 months of their final year at high school into a victory lap that had them circling together around a shining future. By early spring, David had received word that he'd been selected as a candidate for the U.S. Air Force Academy out in Colorado Springs. And on the same exact day, Diane received her letter of acceptance from the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, along with a full scholarship that covered tuition and room and board in exchange for 4 years of military service after she graduated. As high school graduation rolled around in May of 1996, Diane was recognized as one of the most accomplished seniors at Crowley High School, while David was one of the most celebrated seniors at Mansfield High School. And when the students at Mansfield stood up to give David a standing ovation, Diane was right there in the audience clapping as hard as she could, just as David was at Crowley High School when Diane received her awards and diploma. For students and administrators at both schools, these award ceremonies were welcome moments of celebration, because in the past several months, big city problems, drugs, gangs, and violence had started creeping into the once safe and secure borders of both Mansfield and Crowley. Ever since January, the residents of Dallas and Fort Worth, where Diane lived, had been following the tragic news of a child kidnapping that had led to the brutal murder of the 9-year-old hostage, a little girl with shoulder-length blonde hair whose missing person picture had been plastered all over the city. And 5 months into the investigation, and the little girl's murderer had still not been caught. Meanwhile, Mansfield had suffered its own very personal tragedy. In early December, a local farmer had found the body of a high school sophomore in his abandoned field. She had been murdered, and her death had sent shockwaves through the 15,000 residents of Mansfield and the 2,500 high school students who had been her classmates. In the 3 weeks it took local detectives to make an arrest, the school and the town had buzzed with rumors as police tried to sort through the complicated and secret life of a popular and talented teenager. For Diane and David, the combined news of these tragedies made their own worries and problems, mostly their upcoming separation as they headed off to opposite sides of the country for college, seem completely insignificant. So, after the high school awards ceremony, when David and Diane were interviewed by local reporters about their accomplishments and future plans, they told them that there were a lot worse things in life than a long-distance relationship, especially given the strength of their commitment to one another. When the news article was published 10 days later in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, the headline read, "Couple to march to military drums, then wedding bells." And at the start of the summer of 1996, David and Diane put that commitment to the test. On Friday, June 30th, David headed 700 miles northwest to the U.S. Air Force Academy, its 18,000-acre campus located in the remote foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado Springs, Colorado. 2 days later, on Sunday, July 2nd, Diane headed 1,400 miles east to the United States Naval Academy, its 338-acre campus perched on the edge of the Chesapeake River and fully enveloped by the historic city of Annapolis, Maryland. And from the very start of their military education and training, it was Diane who had the most trouble adjusting to the physical challenges and also to the emotional stress of being separated from David. Unlike David, who was actually motivated by the structure and discipline of the military, Diane struggled to fit in socially and to embrace the command structure that put freshmen like herself at the bottom of the totem pole. Meanwhile, that old injury to her left hand from the car accident had made the daily grind of endless push-ups, squats, bear crawls, and other calisthenics not only difficult, but very painful. 5 weeks in, and David, out in Colorado, had become an official Air Force cadet, ready to start the 4-year run to becoming an Air Force pilot. 5 weeks in for Diane, and she was showing alarming and troubling signs of psychological strain. While her letters back home painted a very rosy picture of success and determination, the reality of her situation could not have been more different. Without David, it was like Diane's life was falling apart. According to her squad leader, a freshman named Jason Guild, Diane was only barely making it through the 6-week boot camp at the Naval Academy. She wrote constant emails to David, and when he didn't reply right away, she'd break down into uncontrollable fits of crying. In her required essay, where she was supposed to talk about herself and her ambitions, all she wrote about was David and their engagement. Diane was also starting to withdraw socially. She refused to participate in a program that matched new cadets with local families to help cadets adjust to the stresses of being newcomers at the academy. Diane's supervising officers warned her that she was becoming way too much of a loner and that she was losing her focus and only just meeting the minimum expectations. And when Diane did engage with other people, all she talked about was David. But along with telling anyone who would listen how much she and David loved each other, Diane also talked about David like maybe she didn't fully trust him. But it was Diane, not David, who seemed open to getting involved with someone else, and who dangled that possibility in front of David like a red flag in front of a bull when she told him she was interested in her squad leader, Jason Guild. And when Diane called David to tell him that Jason had kissed her, David immediately sent Jason a threatening email telling him to leave Diane alone. Diane responded with a deluge of emails and letters and more phone calls to David that were equal parts lovesick and angry. Meanwhile, when she was with Jason and her friends, Diane veered back and forth between begging Jason to be her boyfriend and, in the next breath, declaring her undying devotion to David. At first, Diane's roommates assumed that Diane's erratic behavior was caused by the stress of trying to maintain a long-distance relationship with her fiancé. But halfway through boot camp, Diane really seemed to come totally unhinged. It was at that point, in early August, that Diane took her roommates aside and began to point out all these small scars all over her body. And then she began to hint at something very dark in her relationship with David. And finally, in the early morning hours of Sunday, August 25th, one day after officially making it through her 6-week boot camp, Diane didn't just hint at this dark thing. She came right out and told her roommates the whole story. Completely shocked by what they had just heard, Diane's fellow cadets knew they could not keep silent. But what Diane had said was also just so unbelievable that her roommates weren't sure if Diane had actually just made the whole thing up for some reason. So instead of reaching out directly to an academy officer, the cadets went to the academy chaplain, whose job was to offer spiritual and moral guidance. They figured he could decide how to handle the information. 5 days later, on Friday, August 30th, 4 investigators from the outer suburbs of Dallas and Fort Worth, Texas, arrived in the main administration building of the U.S. Naval Academy. Surrounded by the naval officials who had been contacted by the Academy chaplain, the detectives had made the 1,400-mile trip for only one reason. They were there to talk with former Texas resident Diane Zamora. It would turn out all the stress Diane had felt since arriving at the Naval Academy was caused by something much more sinister and disturbing than just Diane's separation from David. Instead, Diane's strange and troubling behavior had been caused by a dark secret that Diane and David had been keeping for a very long time. But to understand what this dark secret was, we have to go back almost 9 months to late November of 1995, when David and Diane were both still seniors in high school. That was the weekend of the cross-country regional meet in Lubbock, Texas, the same regional meet that David had been really bummed about because Diane would not be attending. During the long 5-hour bus ride to and then from Lubbock, David had struck up a friendly conversation with a fellow Mansfield High School student, a young woman who was one of the best runners on the girls' team. And when the bus had finally returned to Mansfield after the meet was all over, this same girl asked David if he could give her a ride home from where they had just been dropped off, which was out front of Mansfield High School. David agreed, but instead of driving straight to her house, he and his new friend made an unplanned detour to a parking lot behind a local elementary school, and not long after parking, the pair had climbed into the back seat of David's car and they had sex. By then, it was a well-known fact at Mansfield High School, where David went to school, that he was engaged. And maybe if Diane had also been a student at Mansfield, she might have found out about David's infidelity. But she didn't, because no one at her school, Crowley High School, had heard about what David had done. So Diane had no idea he had cheated on her. And so over the course of the days that followed David's sexual encounter with the star runner, Diane just acted normal, talking endlessly to David about the purity and sanctity of their love for one another. And day after day, David's guilt over what he had done felt heavier and heavier until he just couldn't stand it any longer. And so finally, on Friday, December 1st, 1995, a few days after spending Thanksgiving with Diane and her family, David told Diane that he had cheated on her. Diane was beyond devastated. Even though the thought of David with someone else was unbearable for Diane to think about, she couldn't stop herself from making David repeat over and over and over again all the little details of the sexual encounter. And the more Diane heard, the more wild and upset she became. To Diane, her virginity had been very precious, a gift that she could only ever give one time. And now David had repaid that gift by cheating on her. When crying and screaming did nothing to make her feel any better, Diane grabbed a fireplace iron and tried to hit David. After David grabbed the iron and took it away from her, Diane turned away from him and just started banging her head against the wall. Over the next couple of days, David and Diane spent hours talking to one another about what happened, but especially for Diane, there was just no way to go back to how she used to feel about David. And for David, along with his sense of guilt, there was something else. He was starting to have conflicting emotions about his relationship with Diane. And so, on the night of Sunday, December 3rd, just 48 hours after coming clean to Diane, David slowly picked up the family telephone in his home and he dialed a phone number and then put the receiver to his ear. A minute later, David heard the familiar voice of 16-year-old Adrian Jones, the smart, bubbly, blonde star runner of the Mansfield High School cross-country team that David had had sex with in the back of his car. After talking for only a few minutes, Adrian agreed to sneak out of her house later that night and meet up with David. Like David, Adrian was an excellent student who talked about becoming a veterinarian after she finished high school. But Adrian also had a rebellious streak, and while she did not have a reputation as someone who slept around, she did enjoy a little bit of flirting and attention from the opposite sex. And while she hadn't told any of her friends about her earlier hookup with David, she decided that if he ever asked her out again, she'd say yes. So by 12:30 a.m., Adrian was looking out her window, anxiously waiting for David to arrive. And even though David wound up being 2 hours late, pulling up the driveway close to 2:30 a.m., Adrian was still wide awake and happy to see him. As soon as she heard the sound of his car engine on her street, Adrian turned on her light so she could give herself one final quick look in the mirror. She was wearing her favorite plaid shorts and t-shirt. Then she switched off the light, made her way quietly down the stairs, and slipped out the back door. After Adrian climbed into the front passenger seat of the Mazda hatchback, David smiled and apologized for being late. Then he turned the car northwest, and they drove along quiet, dark roads until they reached their destination, a large recreation center just over the Mansfield line in the small town of Grand Prairie. Once they arrived, David turned off the car engine. The night was clear and the moon was almost full. To one side of the car, they could see the lake that was part of the recreation center. On the other side of the car, they could see a large empty field fenced off on all sides. Even though the night air was cool, Adrian had rolled down her window and a slight breeze ruffled her thick blonde hair. For just a minute, David sat in the driver's seat without moving. He knew what he was about to do was wrong. But before he could change his mind, he turned toward Adrian and reached across the space between them. As she began to lean toward David, he ran his hands along her arms and then up over her shoulders towards her neck. And then, taking a deep breath, David suddenly closed his strong hands around Adrian's throat and gave her neck a violent jerk. For just a second, Adrian sat there stunned, and then her hands shot up to her neck as she tried to grab David's fingers and pull them away. But as she did this, David only tightened his grip, readjusting himself in his seat, and then he began twisting her neck first to one side and then to the other. Within seconds, Adrian's complete and total shock gave way to a massive rush of adrenaline. And with all of her strength, she grabbed his arms and stopped the violent side-to-side motion and then began forcing her much larger attacker back away from her. And it was while she was grappling with David that Adrian heard a sudden noise coming from the backseat of the car. All at once, she felt David's hands loosen, and they both turned towards the sound. Suddenly, there was a third person in the car with them, a small, slender girl with dark hair and dark eyes. Even as Adrian registered in some part of her brain that this must be David's fiancée, Diane Zamora, Adrian felt the blinding pain of a sudden blow to the side of her head. Dazed, but knowing she was in a fight for her life, Adrian twisted in her seat away from David, away from Diane, and somehow managed to open the car door and she fell out onto the ground. But as Adrian scrambled to her feet, she felt another blow to her head in the same spot, this one even harder. Despite the pain, Adrian still managed to pull herself up onto her feet again, and seconds later she was half staggering, half running towards the open field ahead of her. But before Adrian made it to the fence, she could feel her strength starting to ebb. With one last lurch, Adrian threw herself up and over the 4 strands of the barbed wire fence. But even as she made it to the other side, her sock caught on the barbs and she stumbled forward and kind of twisted and landed on her back. her bloody face looking up at the bright Texas moon. Off in the distance, there was the sound of raised voices, and then a few minutes later, David stood in the field looking down at Adrian, a 9mm Russian-made Makarov pistol in one of his hands. David raised the gun and aimed it at Adrian's face, and then he fired it twice. One round hit Adrian just below her left eye, the other round hit her square in the forehead, right between her eyes. In the last moment of her life, Adrian's hand clutched convulsively into a fist, and her fingers wrapped themselves around a handful of stiff winter grass. 40 minutes later, in the town of Burleson, 20 miles to the west, 16-year-old Jay Green heard a knock on his bedroom window. It was long past midnight, but this was a routine that had played out many times before between Jay and his best friend from the Junior Civil Air Patrol, David Graham. Except this time, when Jay removed the screen from the window to let his friend inside, it wasn't just David standing there. Instead, two people tumbled into the room, landing at Jay's feet. In the faint glow of green and red lights from the plastic Christmas tree set up in the corner of his bedroom, Jay looked down to see David and Diane lying together on the floor, arms wrapped tightly around each other. It looked like there was something dark and liquid spattered on their clothes and faces and hands. When Jay asked David what was going on, David looked up at him and said, "You don't want to know. Don't ask any questions. We were never here. This never happened." A few minutes later, David and Diane went into Jay's bathroom and spent 30 minutes cleaning up. When they came back out, David asked Jay if he could borrow some clean clothes. An hour after that, David and Diane made the 4-mile drive from Jay's house back to Diane's house in Crowley. When David's father called the Zamora's house later that morning to make sure David was up and going to school, he asked his son if he'd heard about that girl from Mansfield that was just found dead in a local farmer's empty field. David said no, then he hung up the phone and stared at Diane in silence. It would turn out, a week earlier when David confessed to Diane that he had had sex with Adrian Jones, Diane had been so furious at David that when he asked her how he could make things between the two of them right again, Diane had told him there was only one way that was going to happen. David would have to kill Adrian. At first, David was stunned by her request, but feeling like he somehow had to avenge Diane's honor, he ultimately agreed to do it. So, beginning early on Sunday, December 3rd, as Diane watched and listened, David started placing calls to Adrian. When he finally reached her, it was about 10:30 p.m. that night. Adrian was on the phone with her boyfriend at the time David called, and Adrian's mother was waiting nearby to make sure Adrian did not stay up too late talking on the phone. Adrian interrupted her call with her boyfriend, whose name was Tracy, to take the incoming call from David. And a few minutes later, she had agreed to meet David that night. Diane told David in no uncertain terms that there was no way she was going to let David meet with Adrian alone. So, after making their preparations, David got behind the wheel of the Zamora family car, and Diane crawled into the trunk space of the car. And because this car was a hatchback, the trunk was not separated from the seating area. Meaning, if you were in the back seat of this car, you could just turn around and look into the trunk. David's plan was to kill Adrian by breaking her neck. But just in case that didn't work, he had brought along his 9mm pistol. Additionally, he had brought a set of heavy round barbell weights that he would use to sink Adrian's dead body in the nearby lake out at the recreation center, where he planned to take Adrian. David packed both the gun and the weights in a duffel bag, and then he put that bag in the trunk next to where Diane was going to be hiding. But it turned out, in David's words, that snapping someone's neck was a lot harder than it looks in the movies. Within minutes of David stopping the car near the recreation center, nothing had gone according to the plan that he had worked out with Diane. When Diane peeked her head up and over the back seat and saw David struggling to break Adrian's neck, Diane dug into the duffel bag next to her and pulled out one of David's weights. Then Diane climbed from the trunk space up and over the back row of seats until she was right behind the front seat where Adrian was fighting for her life. As Diane got into position, Adrian and David heard her, and for a second they both just kind of stopped and turned around to look back toward her. And in this brief second that Adrian is registering that Diane is sitting in the car with them, Diane wound up with that weight and slammed it into the side of Adrian's head. But amazingly, this did not kill Adrian. Adrian somehow managed to get out of the car despite her head being caved in on one side, and then she began running towards the field. But Diane leapt out of the car, chased her down, and slammed her again as she was running in the exact same spot on the side of her head, further crushing her skull. But still, amazingly, Adrian, probably just fueled by adrenaline, kept on moving towards the field. But when she tried to clear the fence, she had gotten stuck on one of the barbs and landed on her back, and she couldn't move and she had no more strength left, and so she just lay there staring up at the moon, wondering what was going to happen to her. By this point, Diane had gone back to the car, but David had grabbed his pistol and charged into the field after Adrian. But when he looked down at her and saw her on the ground with her head caved in and she wasn't moving, he just turned around and walked back to the car and told Diane that Adrian was dead. But Diane was taking no chances, and after kind of peering over David's shoulder in Adrian's direction, she thought she saw Adrian moving, and so she told David, "Go finish the job." A minute later, David had walked back over to the field and was looking down at Adrian, who was very much alive. Her breath was shallow, but she was laying there looking up at him, her eyes wide open, and David just raised his gun and he fired it twice into her face. When Diane and David got back into the car to drive to Jay Green's house to wash the blood off of their clothes and bodies, the first words David said to Diane were, "I love you, baby. Do you believe me now?" In response, Diane answered, "Yes, I believe you. I love you too." In the 5 weeks that followed Adrian's death, Adrian's mother, Linda Jones, told police that on the night before Adrian's body was discovered, she overheard her daughter talking to 2 different boys. Adrian had been talking to her boyfriend, Tracy, who had a rock-solid alibi for the time of the murder, when Adrian had interrupted that conversation to take an incoming call from another boy before switching back to her call with her boyfriend. When Linda asked her daughter that night who the second caller was, Adrian had told her that it was a boy named David from the cross-country team. But even with that tidbit of information, detectives never seriously considered David as a possible suspect, because, according to Adrian's boyfriend, Tracy, Adrian had told him that that incoming call she had received was from a boy named Brian, a guy who sometimes followed Adrian around and hung out at the Golden Fried Chicken drive-thru where Adrian worked. What no one knew at the time was that Adrian had lied to her boyfriend about the identity of the second caller, most likely because she didn't want her boyfriend to ask any questions about David. During the initial murder investigation, when police did ask David if he called Adrian the night of her murder, David simply lied and said, "No, why would I do that?" David then told police that he had an alibi for the night of the murder, that he and his fiancée, Diane, had spent December 3rd and 4th with one another at her house. Taking David at his word, detectives assumed that Linda must have misheard what her daughter had said, and so the police began operating on the idea that what Adrian's boyfriend had been told by Adrian, that Brian was the caller, was the truth. And before long, investigators had zeroed in on Brian as their main suspect. And once they found out that Brian had been paying a lot of unwanted attention to Adrian, they arrested him. But after holding Brian in jail for 3 weeks, police could not find any hard evidence that linked Brian to the killing. After failing to break Brian's alibi, and after Brian passed a lie detector test, police released the traumatized 17-year-old. And after that, the Adrian Jones murder case went cold. But that would change in August of 1996, just 2 months after Diane and David got their standing ovations at their high school graduations and headed off to 2 of the most prestigious military academies in the world. Because there, at the U.S. Naval Academy, separated from David and consumed with guilt, and also with suspicion that David might cheat on her again, Diane began to draw back the curtain on what her relationship with David had truly been like in the months after Adrian's gruesome murder. The scars on her body that she showed her classmates were from David. According to Diane, David had beat her and stabbed her and wrapped a belt around her neck and pulled it tight. And apparently, Diane had done similar things to David, and he had marks all over his body as well. While the image David and Diane presented to the world was that of a golden couple utterly devoted to one another, in private, they had started to physically as well as emotionally torture each other over this terrible secret they both shared. And finally, on August 14th, Diane came out and told her roommates exactly what that secret was. That almost 9 months earlier, back in December of 1995, she and David had killed 16-year-old Adrian Jones. And as soon as Diane's roommates passed that information on to the military chaplain, he had informed the attorney for the Naval Academy, at which point naval officers had called the police department in Mansfield, Texas, and told them they needed to come out and talk to one of their students. When Texas investigators arrived in Annapolis on August 30th to question Diane about Adrian's murder, Diane denied everything, saying that the entire story she had told her roommates was just a Texas tall tale, something she had made up in an effort to get her roommates' attention. But when investigators flew out to the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado to question David's initial denial that he had had anything to do with Adrian's death did not hold up for very long. By that time, investigators had tracked down Jay Green, who told them about the bizarre visit he'd received from Diane and David in the early hours of December 4th. And when he was ordered, not asked, by Air Force officials to take a lie detector test, David failed. A couple of days later, on the night of Thursday, September 5th, David sat down at a word processor in a small room at the U.S. Air Force Academy Administration Building and typed out and then signed a 4.5-page confession. In it, he wrote that when his, quote, precious relationship with Diane was damaged by his, quote, thoughtless actions, which is how he described his sexual encounter with Adrian, the only thing that could satisfy Diane's, quote, womanly vengeance was for David to kill the girl who had, for an instant, taken Diane's place in David's life. Confronted with David's confession, Diane quickly responded with her own formal statement that corroborated much of what David had already told investigators. And immediately after both of them had been arrested and charged with capital murder, David and Diane continued to defend each other and declare their love for one another both publicly and through the many letters they wrote back and forth. But by the time Diane's case went to trial a couple of years later, in early February of 1998, David and Diane had not only recanted their confessions, they had also turned on each other. Diane portrayed herself as an innocent party who had been abused and manipulated by David, and it was David who actually murdered Adrian Jones. The jury did not buy Diane's story, and on February 17, 1998, Diane was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. 5 months later, when David's case came to trial, defense attorneys argued that David had been pressured by investigators to confess to Adrian's murder. But the jury disagreed, and on July 24, 1998, David was also found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison as well. Unlike Diane, David has expressed remorse for his role in the brutal murder of Adrian Jones, and he has said his punishment fits the crime. Both David and Diane will be eligible for parole in 2036. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts: Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts, and all of those shows will pop up. To watch hundreds more stories like the one you just heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Hello fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. I'm here today to tell you all about what it actually means now that we've moved over to the SiriusXM family. Big picture, it means we are going to make more content for you. Right now, you get one YouTube video a week on Saturday. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to have the Saturday upload be the same, but then also the Mr. Ballin podcast. Well, we've begun already filming those episodes like a YouTube video. So that's a second piece of content every week.
Then there's 2 other shows that you guys don't even know about yet, which means on any given week, you could have up to 4 new video pieces of content on the Mr. Ballin channel. And also, all these pieces of content will double as podcasts as well. This new content schedule is going to start early next year. Also, there's one other thing I want to clarify, which is the state of Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries and Redacted. Those shows were created in collaboration with Wondery, but now we're partnered with Sirius, and so we're not going to be making any new episodes of either of those shows. For now, if you want to hear my podcast episodes 1 week early and ad-free, make sure to subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. Keep on the lookout for more announcements in the coming weeks. Thank you. One day in 2004, a young man was eating breakfast and watching the local news when suddenly this story about a savage murder came on. Now, at first, the young man actually wasn't paying all that much attention to the story, in part because this murder happened pretty far away from where he lived, about 100 miles away. But at some point on the news, the picture of the murder victim flashed across the screen. And when he saw it, he just froze. And for a minute, that's all he did. He just stared at the screen, could not believe what he was seeing. He put his food down, and then he rushed over to his computer, he fired it up, and immediately began searching through the chat log of an old conversation he had had. And after scrolling for a little while, he eventually found what he was looking for, and at that point, he printed out the entire chat log and rushed to go show the police. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please go over to the Follow Button's house and proceed to eat all their food in their fridge, but put back all the empty containers. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of June 3rd, 2004, a 23-year-old college junior named Jesse Valencia walked into a restaurant in Columbia, Missouri. His friends were already there. They were sitting at a table in the back of the restaurant, and as soon as they saw him, they waved him over. And so Jesse made his way over to sit with them. Jesse was a student at the University of Missouri, and he was majoring in journalism and pre-law. The spring semester had just ended a few weeks ago, and as much as Jesse had loved the semester and he really had enjoyed what he was studying, he was looking forward to some time off. He wanted to see his friends and go to some good parties. Jesse had always been a very outgoing person with a very active social life, but sometimes that characteristic sort of got him in trouble. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, he'd had to go to court over a charge of obstructing a government operation, which he'd picked up 2 months earlier when he refused to leave a house party that the cops were breaking up. And as soon as he sat down at the table with his friends, one of them immediately asked him, hey, how'd that court hearing go? And Jesse had said, it didn't go too well. He thought the whole thing was kind of ridiculous, and he had hoped the charge would have been dropped already. But when he had gone to the courtroom, he found out the charge had actually been upgraded. The prosecutor had changed it to obstructing a government operation by physical interference, which was worse. But Jesse said, he still wasn't that worried about it. He said he had pleaded not guilty, and his plan was to fight this thing to the very end, even if it took all summer. However, the reality was this charge was actually the least of Jesse's problems. He had much bigger things weighing on his mind that summer. His longtime boyfriend, Jack Barry, had broken up with him recently, and he was having a very hard time coping with that. Jack had wanted to stay friends, but the reality was, even though, the intention was good, it just made things harder for Jesse, because it meant that Jesse and Jack were still spending quite a bit of time together and still talking and socializing. And while Jack felt like things were over romantically, Jesse didn't feel that way. It just sort of felt like they were perpetually on the verge of getting back together, even though they weren't. And then whenever Jesse would try to talk to Jack about, maybe trying to make things work again, Jack would immediately just turn him down. And so the whole situation was just really difficult. And so without Jack anymore, Jesse had become very lonely. And he had been trying to fill that void with random hookups, meeting guys online and inviting them to the hotel where he worked as a night clerk, but for the most part, it was sort of shallow and didn't mean anything. At one point, Jesse had been having this secret affair with an older man, which had been exciting, but Deep down, what Jesse really wanted was just a real relationship, like he had had with Jack. And these random hookups were not that. And so at this point, basically every time Jesse went out socially, no matter what he was doing, he was always kind of on the hunt for somebody who could potentially have, long-term relationship potential. And this night was no exception. And so that night, Jesse and his friends had a nice dinner together. And then when they were done, they left the restaurant and walked a few blocks to a gay dance club called Soko Club. It was dark and the music was loud and thumping. And as soon as they walked inside, Jesse immediately weaved his way through the crowd on the dance floor over to the DJ booth. He asked the DJ to play his favorite song, which was Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. And the DJ just sort of rolled their eyes. Jesse knew the DJ was very likely annoyed with him because Jesse requested that song every single time he came to this club. But Jesse never had let other people's opinions stop him from doing what he wanted. And so he didn't care. He just wanted the song played. And so after he had made his request, Jesse went over to the bar and ordered a drink. And while he waited, he saw a young man standing alone at the other end of the bar. Once the bartender passed Jesse his drink, Jesse went over and asked the man if he wanted to dance. The man smiled and said, sure. And then one dance turned into two, turned into three, and pretty soon the two had spent the whole night together. Now, it was hard to hear each other over the loud music, but over the course of several dances, Jesse had learned that this man's name was Ed McDevitt, and he was training to be a chef. Jesse felt like Ed was a really nice, cool guy, and it seemed like they had an immediate connection. And so when the club closed, Jesse asked if Ed wanted to come home with him. Ed said yes. And after that, Jesse asked his friend Jennifer if she wouldn't mind giving them a ride back to Jesse's apartment. She said, of course. And so shortly after that, the trio left the club, they got in Jennifer's car, and they drove back to Jesse's apartment. And when Jesse and Ed got out, Jennifer said, hey, tomorrow night I'm having a party at my place. You two should come by. And Jesse, he turned to Ed and kind of winked at him and said, yeah, hopefully we'll both be there. And then Jennifer drove off. After Jennifer had driven off, Jesse walked Ed down the stairs to his very run-down basement apartment. And as soon as they went inside, Ed saw the sea of all these history books stacked all over the living room. It would turn out Jesse was really into ancient Greek history. And so Ed began walking around, opening up all these old history books. And as Ed did, Jesse began regaling him with, tales of the Battle of Thermopylae, how the Spartans were outnumbered and how they prevailed, and talking about Zeus and the ancient Greek gods, and just kind of going off all the stuff that Jesse really enjoyed about, ancient Greek history. And Ed, as he listened to it, just said, I really don't know much about history, but it's really fascinating that you're so into it. And so from there, the rest of the night went great for the two of them. They would spend the night together. And then at 10 a.m. the next morning, as Ed was getting ready to leave, they made plans to meet up again at Jennifer's party that night. Before Ed left, he wrote his phone number down on a scrap piece of paper and gave it to Jesse. And Jesse took the paper and then walked Ed to the door and gave him a hug and a kiss before he left. And then once he was gone, Jesse just hoped that, maybe this wasn't just a meaningless hookup. Maybe this had the basis of a strong, long-term relationship, the one thing Ed really wanted. Around noon that day, Jesse was eating a quick lunch before heading out for work when he heard a knock on his door. He walked over and opened it up, and he saw his landlord standing in the hallway. And his landlord looked pretty mad. He told Jesse that, hey, it's the 4th of the month, and you still haven't paid rent. Jesse apologized profusely and just said, it totally slipped his mind, and he promised he would get it to the landlord that afternoon. But after the landlord accepted his answer and, Jesse shut the door, he couldn't help but have this sort of sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, because the truth was, he didn't have the money. Jesse had grown up in a very poor family in a small town in Kentucky. He was actually the first person in his whole family to go to college, and he had paid his bills by working as a hotel clerk, the same job his mother had had back home. Now, Jesse loved his family, and he spoke to them basically every single day. He would call them all the time. But at the same time, he had always felt so trapped in his conservative, ultra-religious hometown. So he had left and tried to sort of reinvent himself as someone new, the kind of person who can do anything and go anywhere. And so even though he had done that, it would turn out that making real money was something that he just hadn't quite figured out yet. Before Jesse left for work that afternoon, he scrounged up all the cash he could find, but it still wasn't enough to make rent. He dropped the cash in the landlord's mailbox anyway, with a note promising he would get the rest of it together in a couple of weeks. Then he walked to his job at the campus inn and spent an uneventful evening behind the front desk, counting down the hours until the end of his shift. And as soon as the end of his shift came, when the clock struck 11 p.m., he bolted home and immediately changed clothes before heading out to Jennifer's party, where he was supposed to meet his new love interest, Ed McDevitt. However, when Jesse walked into that party, he didn't see Ed. He did a lap around the apartment, checking every room, but he wasn't there. And so Jesse just grabbed a beer out of the fridge and began chatting with Jennifer while he waited. But after a while, he checked his watch and realized that either Ed was running really late or he just was not coming. So, trying to tell himself that it was not quite time to be disappointed, maybe there was an explanation here, Jesse went outside and called the phone number that Ed had written down on that piece of paper that morning. Now, this phone number was for a landline phone, and so, Jesse, he punched it in and he listened and it rang for a few beats, and then somebody picked up, and it was a guy, but it was not Ed. It was somebody whose name was Mark Butler, and Jesse had never heard of this guy, and he asked, where's Ed? And Mark explained that he was Ed's roommate, and that actually Ed was asleep right now. He had to work in the morning, and so he had decided actually not to go to the party, to Jennifer's party. He just wanted to sleep. Now, as Mark was telling him this, Jesse was trying to make sense of okay, is Mark like Ed's boyfriend or something? Are they together, or are they just roommates? And also, Jesse couldn't help but feel like Mark clearly did not want to be talking to Jesse right now. It was pretty clear in his tone that he was trying to just get off the phone. But Jesse was not ready to just, mail it in here. He wanted to see Ed. And so he told Mark, well, hold on a minute. Can you please go wake him up? I need to talk to him. And at first, Mark was like, no, he's asleep. He has work in the morning. He does not want me waking him up. But Jesse was relentless and just begged Mark to please, just for a second, put him on the phone. And eventually, Mark relented. About a minute later, a very groggy-sounding Ed hopped on the phone, and as soon as Jesse heard his voice, he was so excited, and he basically pitched Ed hard on why he should not go to bed and come out to this party, and that he really wanted to see him. And also, hey, bring your friend Mark too. That was fine. Now, it's not really clear if Ed was excited about this idea, but he would eventually say, fine, I'll come out and meet you, and I will bring Mark. When they got there, Mark would only stay at Jennifer's party for a little while before he headed out on his own. But Ed and Jesse, they would stick around until about 2 a.m. At that point, they would leave Jennifer's house and go to another party across the street. At around 3 a.m., though, Ed said he really did have to get going. It was so late, he had to get up in the morning, he had to go. And so at this point, Jesse understood that this was reasonable. And so he walked him out to the sidewalk and then asked him if, hey, do you want to come over to my place? But Ed said, no, really, I have to get home. I have to go to bed. However, before Ed did finally leave, the two of them would make plans to see each other in just a couple of days. After Ed had taken off, Jesse wandered across the street to say goodbye to Jennifer. And then after that, he began making the walk to his own apartment. And as he was making this short walk to his own place, he began to think that he didn't want to go home alone. If Ed didn't want to come over, well, he was going to find somebody else who would. And so his first thought was to call his ex, Jack. And so Jesse called Jack a few times, and when Jack did not pick up, after all, it's 3 a.m, and they are no longer in a relationship, it's sort of reasonable that he wouldn't, but at that point, Jesse still wanted to see him, and so he walked a few blocks out of his way to make an actual stop at Jack's apartment. Jesse went right up to the door and banged on it, but nobody came to the door. Jack didn't answer. At this point, Jesse began to wonder if, well, maybe Jack's out with somebody else right now, and he suddenly felt so jealous. Or worse, maybe Jack is here and he knows I'm here, but he doesn't want to see me and he's ignoring me. After a couple of minutes of standing there and knocking a few more times and still not hearing anything from Jack, Jesse finally gave up and stumbled back to his own apartment, drunk and lonely, and a bit heartbroken. Jesse finally stepped foot inside his apartment and shut the door behind him at about 3:45 a.m. However, right after he'd gotten undressed and flopped down on his bed, he heard a knock at the front door. At 2 p.m. the following day, so Saturday, June 5th, 2004, a college student walked out of an apartment just down the street from Jesse's building, and they were carrying a backpack and a cooler. His friends had just pulled into the parking lot, and they were about to head out for a weekend trip to St. Louis. But while he was loading his stuff into the trunk, he noticed somebody lying in the grass nearby, wearing nothing but a pair of running shorts. Now, at first, he assumed, this was just somebody passed out drunk from a crazy Friday night party, which sort of happened all the time in a college town like Columbia. But when he took a few steps closer to be sure this person was okay, he saw flies buzzing around their body. About 30 minutes later, Columbia police detective John Short felt his pager go off. He unclipped it from his belt loop, and he saw there was a message from his boss's phone number that just read 911. Detective Short called his boss right away, and he was given the address for a crime scene just off the University of Missouri campus. Short drove there, parked his car on the curb, and then walked over to the yellow tape that was keeping crowds of worried neighbors away from this crime scene. Another detective, Tim Geiger, waved to Short and led him over to the patch of grass where the victim was lying. It was a young man sprawled out on his back, and he was wearing a pair of light blue running shorts with no shoes, no socks, and no shirt. And across his throat was this very deep gash. The medical examiner was already there, and she was crouched down next to the body, and she told Detective Short that a few things were already standing out to her. She pointed to the bruises that were all over the victim's face, their arms, and their torso. But when she lifted the victim's hands, there were no defensive wounds on them. She told Short that that was pretty unusual for a knife attack, where the victims usually got their hands up, trying to defend themselves, and as a result, they got their hands cut up. She also pointed out that the blood had run down both sides of the victim's neck and pooled under his body. But there was no blood at all on the front of his body, which meant he was probably lying down right there in the grass when his throat actually got cut. Finally, the medical examiner pulled back the victim's eyelids and showed Short the hemorrhaging in his eyes, which they both knew was typically a sign of strangulation. And so putting it all together, Short theorized that, the victim's killer had likely choked him out and then laid him on the grass and then slit his throat while he was laying there unconscious, unable to defend himself. The detective looked down at his victim's bare feet and noticed they were covered in dirt, like he had been running at some point outside. Short doubted that the encounter between his victim and the killer began on the lawn where the body was found, and now he just wondered if maybe there had been some sort of a chase here, and that this was just where the killer had finally caught up to the victim. But since there was no ID on the victim, Short had no idea who he was or where he'd been running from. And so Short stood up and stepped away from the body so crime scene techs could load it into a body bag. Just then, another squad car pulled up and two more officers got out, Sergeant Kenneth Smith and Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was the beat cop who typically patrolled this neighborhood. So another sergeant on scene had radioed for him to come over and see if maybe he could help identify the victim. And so at this point, Short told the crime scene techs to go ahead and unzip the body bag and let Officer Rios take a look. And Rios came over and he looked inside, and after a second, he said that he did recognize this young man. He said it was a college kid that he'd actually arrested at a house party just a couple of months ago. He said his name was Jesse Valencia. And so, less than an hour into his investigation, Detective Short now had a name for his victim and some pretty good guesses about how his victim was killed. His next task was figuring out who might have wanted Jesse Valencia dead. So, Short looked up Jesse's address, and he found his apartment building was only a block away. So, he walked over there. And while the forensics team went inside the apartment to look for evidence, an officer was posted outside the building to make sure no one came or went until the crime scene was officially cleared. Short walked into the building and headed down the stairs to Jesse's unit. And there, the crime scene tech who was dusting the doorway for prints told him that when they'd arrived, the door was actually already open. And so Short went inside the actual unit and began looking around. There was no blood anywhere, and nothing was broken or overturned, so there was no clear sign of a struggle. But the door being left open suggested that Jesse must have left in a hurry. And this certainly matched Short's theory about the fight between Jesse and his killer starting in one location and ending on the lawn. Short figured that, Jesse must have run out of his apartment in a panic and made it a block away to that grass before his killer finally overtook him. And so as Short began to consider this, he also started to think, okay, well, Jesse, who appeared to be in reasonably good shape for his age, if he was chased down and tackled and killed only a block away from his apartment, it sort of suggested that his killer likely was pretty strong and pretty fast. So we're talking about somebody who is in relatively good shape. That's the killer. At least that's the profile he's developed in his mind. And also, the way that Jesse was actually killed, having his throat cut open so violently, it just seemed kind of personal, which suggested that whoever killed Jesse likely was somebody Jesse actually knew. And so with that in mind, Short finished his sweep of Jesse's apartment and then asked a crime scene tech to prioritize getting access to the cell phone and computer that he saw on Jesse's desk. Then he walked out of the apartment and across the hall to the door of Jesse's closest neighbor, and he knocked. A moment later, a very confused-looking young man poked his head out and asked Short what was going on. Short told him that he was investigating a murder and wanted to ask him a few questions. The young man at first just seemed totally shocked and appalled to be hearing this. But then it was like this look of realization washed over his face. He told Short that the previous night, he had actually woken up to the sound of very clearly two grown men fighting in Jesse's apartment. And one of those men was clearly Jesse, because this neighbor heard Jesse clearly saying over and over again, "No," and "Stop it," to this other man. Now, the neighbor kind of sheepishly said, they didn't actually do anything about this. They actually just kind of banged on their own wall and said, "Hey, stop it over there." And then shortly after that, the noise had stopped, and the neighbor had kind of forgotten about it and gone to sleep, not realizing what he was likely hearing was the beginning of Jesse's murder. The neighbor told Short that when they had woken up that afternoon, he'd actually gone across the hall to apologize to Jesse for being so rude the night before. But the neighbor said he found Jesse's door was open, and he didn't look inside. He felt like that was kind of rude. But what he thought was, okay, maybe Jesse was so drunk the night before, that was part of the reason that he must have been having this fight. And so perhaps he was so drunk, he just forgot to close the door. The neighbor said he did try knocking on the opened door a couple of times, but Jesse never came to the door, and so the neighbor just kind of left it at that and went about their business. And so after hearing this, Detective Short asked this neighbor if he had any idea who the other man was that Jesse was fighting with. But the neighbor said he didn't. Jesse, for the most part, kept to himself, and really the neighbor didn't know Jesse well at all, so he did not know who this other person was. After that, Short thanked the neighbor for the information, then he turned around and headed back inside of Jesse's apartment. And so at this point, Short was convinced that, based on the neighbor's testimony, that whatever fight led to Jesse's death likely did begin in Jesse's apartment. And so now Short just had to figure out who were the people that could have potentially been inside of Jesse's apartment late at night like that. Was this somebody who was a friend, a love interest? Was Jesse trying to kick them out and it spurned a fight? Like, he didn't know, but who were the people in Jesse's life that could have been there late at night? That's what he had to figure out. And luckily, at that very moment, one of the crime scene techs had Jesse's cell phone and he was holding it in the air like he had found something. Now, they wouldn't be able to do a full phone dump until they got it back to the station, and they hadn't even touched the laptop yet. But they had gotten access to Jesse's call logs, and the tech told Short that there was something in there that he definitely wanted to see. Because the last time Jesse used his cell phone, according to this log, it was to call somebody named Jack Berry 7 times between 3 and 3:18 that morning. So right away, Detective Short looked up Jack Berry's information, and he found his apartment's address and saw it was not far from Jesse's, and so he drove right over there. Short knocked on the door, and just a moment later, a young man answered, and he had very red, puffy eyes like he'd clearly been crying. Even though Jesse's body had only been discovered a few hours ago, this young man did not seem surprised at all to see the detective. He told the detective that he had already heard the terrible news. A friend had told him. After exchanging niceties and the young man confirming that he was in fact Jack, Short followed Jack into his living room. And as they sat down, Short asked Jack about all those 3 a.m. phone calls from Jesse. Jack looked like he was really struggling to hold it together as he told the detective that Jesse was his ex-boyfriend, and Jesse had kept badgering him, Jack, for them to get back together, and Jack didn't want to. And so those phone calls were very likely a product of more badgering from Jack. Jack said the night before, he had been woken up by his phone ringing over and over and over again, and before he could even look at the caller ID, he heard a knock at his front door, and he saw it was the middle of the night, and then he leaned over and saw the caller was Jesse, and he sort of figured that, okay, he's calling me. It's very likely him at the front door. I don't want to see him right now. And so Jack just decided he would ignore Jesse and hope he went away. Now, when Jack said this, it seemed very clear he was sort of reliving that moment in his mind. Like, maybe if he had let Jesse in or engaged with him in some way, maybe Jesse would still be alive. That was sort of the insinuation. But Detective Short was thinking, okay, well, even though he seems like he's being very earnest in telling me this, it does mean that he doesn't really have an alibi. He's basically saying, at the time, Jesse was killed, I was home alone by myself, which was pretty weak. However, before Short could begin to poke holes in the alibi, Jack said that, despite the fact that they had broken up, that he and Jesse were, at least in his mind, still on good terms. In fact, they had spoken just the day before on the phone, before getting all those nighttime phone calls. It was during the afternoon. And during that phone call, Jesse had told him about a new guy he'd met at a club the night before. And his name was Ed McDevitt. That night, Detective Short stood outside of an interrogation room at the police station, watching Ed McDevitt through the two-way glass. Short knew his investigation was moving basically at lightning speed here, but there was still quite a bit of pressure on him to get this case solved even faster, because Columbia was a college town where kids were used to feeling safe, and the murder of a student just a few blocks off campus had sort of shattered that sense of trust. And so, students and parents and staff of the university really wanted Short to get this thing done. And now, looking at Ed through the glass, Short wondered if maybe this was the killer. Maybe this was the guy. After all, Ed was shaking and fidgety looking. He seemed sort of like an emotional wreck, which could mean, of course, he was just upset because he was connected to the murder victim. That's traumatic. Or it could mean he's hiding something, and now he's about to be interrogated by the police. Something that would certainly cause a big emotional reaction. Eventually, Short went inside and sat down across the table, and he asked Ed to explain exactly what he had done the night before. And Ed, in a very nervous, shaky voice, told the detective that he and his roommate, a guy named Mark Butler, had met Jesse at a party a little after 11 p.m. He said he ultimately went back home again around 3 a.m., leaving Jesse on the sidewalk, still very alive and well. Ed said his roommate Mark had actually seen him return to his apartment at 3 a.m., and Ed said when he went inside, he went straight to bed, and then he had gotten up early for work. Ed said he was at work when he got the call from police, telling him that Jesse had been found dead. Detective Short listened to Ed's story and asked a few follow-up questions, and then also took a DNA sample from Ed. And then after that, he told Ed that he was also going to get a warrant to search Ed's home. Ed was already such a wreck that, when Short told him about this, search of his home, Ed didn't even really react. However, when Short left the interview room, despite feeling pretty confident that Ed could absolutely be a suspect, he also went and, followed procedure and looked up Ed's roommate, Mark Butler. And he discovered in the police department system that there was Mark Butler, and sure enough, he had a criminal record. So, overnight, while a forensics team was searching Ed and Mark's home, Short actually brought Mark down to the station for an interview. But in reality, Short wasn't expecting Mark to become this primary suspect here. He just wanted to be thorough and rule out anybody who'd seen Jesse that night, and obviously Mark was one of those people. But almost immediately in their interview, Mark started saying some very odd things. He told Short right out the gate that he did not like Jesse, and actually he said point blank that he didn't really care that Jesse was dead. But he also clarified to Detective Short that, he was just Ed's roommate. He was not seeing him romantically, so this had nothing to do with jealousy. He just did not like Jesse. Mark confirmed that he did see Ed when he returned from the party around 3 a.m., just like Ed had said, but Mark had actually not stuck around. He said that after Ed had come back to the apartment, Mark had left to go on a date of his own, and he actually didn't know what time he got back. And so as he was saying this, Short realized that meant Mark was out and about, sort of unaccounted for, at the same time that Jesse was killed. And so obviously, something seemed off about Mark. And so Short took a DNA sample and added Mark to the suspect list. The next morning, Sunday, June 6th, after catching a few hours of sleep, Detective Short gathered his team for a meeting. The mood was tense. Everybody was exhausted and very much on edge from spending nearly 24 hours straight working on this case. But when they went around the room and talked about the flood of leads they'd all followed up on yesterday, it didn't actually seem like they had much to show for it. There were now several suspects in play, but none of them seemed to have a good reason to want to kill Jesse Valencia. Jesse apparently had been hounding his ex-boyfriend Jack about trying to get back together, which Jack did not want, and the multiple late-night phone calls and the knocking on the door unannounced, it just seemed like harassment. So it was possible that maybe Jack had gone over to confront Jesse and things got out of hand. But Jack had told Detective Short that he and Jesse had remained friends after the breakup. And some of the other detectives said that Jesse's friends had said the same thing. The two had remained friends. So it seemed pretty unlikely that things between them would have escalated so much that, somebody got killed. Then there was Ed McDevitt, Jesse's new lover, who had seemed pretty nervous during his interrogation. One of the detectives told Short that while searching Ed's house, they'd found a bag full of chef's knives, and some of them were large and sharp enough that they could easily have been the murder weapon. But Ed worked in a restaurant and was training to be a chef, so owning kitchen knives was hardly a smoking gun. And then as for Ed's roommate, Mark Butler, he did have a criminal past and openly said he did not like Jesse and didn't care that he died. But they'd only met one time, and very likely they would never have seen each other again. So it seemed very unlikely that he would go through the trouble of following Jesse home and killing him. Like, to what end? And so Detective Short was getting really frustrated. He just couldn't make sense of any of these suspects. It was like something was missing here. And so he turned to two of his detectives, Jeff Westbrook and Barbara Cook, and told them to go to some local bars that Jesse frequented and just sort of ask around about Jesse, in case there were other leads that they had not uncovered yet. However, right after Detective Short walked out of that meeting that morning, another detective ran up to him and pulled him into a quiet corner and told him a tip had just come in. And it was so sensitive that they were going to have to keep it under wraps even amongst the investigators. The detective told Short that a friend of Jesse's who lived in St. Louis had called the tip in through Crime Stoppers. He said that he and Jesse chatted online all the time, and that Jesse at one point had told him about a secret affair he was having with an older man. And this older man was actually an officer in the Columbia Police Department. Later that day, so this is Sunday, June 6th, 2004, 2 days after Jesse was killed, Detective Short sat at his desk flipping through printouts of all these online chat logs. And these logs showed conversations between Jesse and the friend of his who had called in the tip that Jesse was having this affair with an officer from Short's own police department. In the chats, Jesse wrote all about this relationship. Jesse had seemed to find it pretty exciting at first, having this police officer come by in uniform and carrying on these secret meetups in the middle of the night. But recently, Jesse had begun to suspect that this police officer was married. And this made Jesse furious. He had told this friend in the chat log that he wasn't going to be someone's other woman. However, to Short's frustration, Jesse never actually named the officer that he was having this affair with. He only ever referred to him as Columbia's finest. And so whoever this mystery cop was, Detective Short thought they were the most likely suspect. Because unlike Jesse's other lovers, this officer had something to lose if this relationship went south. If Jesse told anybody about this affair, well, the police officer's career could be on the line because they clearly were carrying on this totally illicit affair while on duty. That's not okay. And also they were using their position and power potentially to actually land this relationship. And then also on top of that, the police officer's marriage would likely be destroyed. But Short also knew that he had to move very carefully here, because now he was investigating his own department, which meant that the killer could literally be in the room with him at any time. And so as he walked through the office to refill his coffee, Short found himself scanning the face of every officer he passed, and he realized there wasn't a single person here he could actually trust. Short brought all the files on Jesse's case into his office, and then he told his secretary to find him a roster of the department's entire staff. Then he locked the door, sat at his desk, and pulled out the records on Jesse's friends who had been interviewed already. And he went down the list himself, calling each and every one of them to dig for more information. Quite a few of them said that Jesse had told them about this cop he was sleeping with. And one of them remembered Jesse referring to this officer as just Anderson. And so when Short's secretary came back with the staff roster, Short began looking through it, and he discovered out of the 200 plus officers in the entire department, there were only 2 officers that had the name Anderson, Brad Anderson and Ted Anderson. And so the next step was trying to figure out if either of them had a connection to Jesse Valencia. And so Short pulled out the records from Jesse's arrest at the house party back in April. And as he flipped through it, he realized Brad Anderson was one of the 3 officers who responded to that party. The pieces fit together perfectly. Jesse and Brad Anderson, the police officer, would have met around the same time that Jesse began messaging his friend in St. Louis about this secret affair with a cop. And so at this point, Short felt like he had just found the killer. So he grabbed a manila folder off his desk, stepped out of his office, locking the door behind him. Then he did a lap around the whole station, and eventually he spotted Brad Anderson in the locker room, chatting with a few other officers as he put on his uniform. Now, Short wanted to be very careful here, because if Brad Anderson was the killer, he certainly didn't want him to realize he was under suspicion right now. So Short waited in the hallway until Brad walked out of the locker room, and then as casually as possible, Short caught up with him and pulled him aside. Short opened up the manila folder he had brought with him and showed Brad a photo of Jesse Valencia, asking if he recognized him. And Brad squinted at the photo for a second, and then after thinking, he said, "Yeah, that's the kid I arrested at a party a few months ago." Short asked Brad if he had seen Jesse at all since the arrest. And Brad nodded and said, yeah. He said that about a month ago, Jesse had called in a noise complaint, and Brad had been the one sent out to check on it. But by the time Brad got there, the noise had stopped, so he was only there for a couple of minutes before leaving. And that was it. To Short, nothing about Brad's demeanor seemed nervous or suspicious. In fact, it really seemed like he didn't have any clue why the detective was asking him about Jesse Valencia. So if he was the killer, it seemed like he was going to be very hard to crack. Short was about to let Brad go and just wait to talk to him once he had more evidence, but just then, Brad's partner, Officer Rios, walked by. And when he walked by, he looked over and he saw the manila folder with Jesse Valencia's photo inside of it that Short was showing Brad Anderson. And Rios, without even thinking, made this comment under his breath that was clearly directed at his partner. It was like this really in bad taste comment where he was like, "Oh, looks like your gay lover's dead." When Short heard this, he practically sprinted back to his office. Brad Anderson sort of shrugged off the comment made by Rios about, Jesse being his gay lover, but Short felt like what Rios said was a pretty big deal, because even though, again, it was terrible in bad taste humor, that's a terrible thing to say, but maybe there's truth there. Maybe Rios knows that Brad Anderson was seeing Jesse Valencia. Maybe they really were in a relationship. Now, in the moment, Short did not aggressively follow up on that comment and demand to know if Brad had actually been in a relationship with Jesse before he died. Instead, all three of them just kind of went their separate ways, and Short, hustled back to his office. And when he was in his office, right as he sat down, there was a knock on the door. And when the door opened, it was Short's secretary. And she told him there was someone who had been waiting to see him. And then she let in this very nervous-looking young man who introduced himself as Jesse's friend. And he said his name was Andy Schermerhorn. Andy sat down and told Short that just a few weeks earlier, he and Jesse had gone out together and then gone back to Jesse's apartment. But around 3 a.m., they were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jesse went to answer it, and a uniformed police officer walked in, shining a flashlight. And to Andy's surprise, Jesse led this officer right into the bedroom, and he joined them for a threesome. And then after they were done, the cop told Andy, "You better keep this a secret." Detective Short couldn't believe it. The final piece of evidence he needed had just fallen into his lap. Andy said he did not know the officer's name. So Detective Short got out a department yearbook and told him to flip through it to see if maybe the guy he saw that night was in there. But Andy just held up his hand and said he didn't need to do that. And Detective Short was like, "Well, what do you mean? Why can't you do that?" And Andy said, "Well, because when I came in here, the guy I met, he was out in the hall." Based on the investigation that would follow this revelation, the following is what happened to Jesse Valencia in the early morning of June 5th, 2004. Around 3 a.m., right around the time that Jesse was leaving his friend Jennifer's party, Jesse's killer was drinking beers with a few friends after work. And then, just before dawn, the killer wrapped up, got in their car to drive home. But as they were driving, they decided to make a stop along the way at Jesse's apartment. They were expecting another quick, no-strings-attached, late-night secret hookup, but when they got there, Jesse was very drunk and in a terrible mood. Jesse told the killer that he had figured out they were married, and so now he was not interested in them at all. He didn't want to see him anymore. But when he told the killer to leave and the killer refused, Jesse said, "Fine, I'll go to your police chief and I will tell them about our affair." And that's when the killer snapped. If their secret got out, it would cost them everything. So in their mind, They had to silence Jesse before he could ruin them. Jesse tried to run, but he only made it about a block before the killer caught up with him, wrapped an arm around his neck, and put him in a vicious chokehold until his body went limp. And then the killer laid Jesse out on the grass, took out a pocket knife, and brutally slashed his throat. And then, on the way home, the killer very skillfully disposed of the murder weapon, ensuring nobody would ever find it, because they knew the knife was the only piece of hard evidence that could ever link them to the murder. After that, they made their way back home, parked in the driveway, and as they were walking up to the front door, they looked up and saw their wife in the kitchen window, preparing a bottle for their baby son. And then just before going inside, the killer unpinned the name tag on their uniform that said Anderson, and they swapped it for another name tag that they had hidden in their glove box. And this name tag was the killer's real name, Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was Brad Anderson's partner. He was the one who identified Jesse's body at the crime scene and made that awful comment about Brad Anderson's gay lover. It's believed that Officer Rios was lying to Jesse about his name, and in fact, he actually stole the name tag not of Brad Anderson, but of the other Anderson, Ted Anderson. He was using his name tag and parading around like he was him whenever he was with Jesse. Rios was arrested, and in May of 2005, almost a year after Jesse's murder, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. But after an appeal, he got a new trial, and the charge was reduced to second-degree murder. However, he was still found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the Mr. Ballin podcast, as well as Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see you. Late on a June evening in 2000, a detective with the Easton, Pennsylvania Police Department sat in his car on a darkened neighborhood street, watching a house right nearby and waiting patiently. After what seemed like an eternity, finally somebody emerged from this house, and in their hands were a couple of bulky trash bags. The detective tensed up, but they didn't move. The detective kept watching as this person placed the trash bags on the curb for pickup in the morning, and then this person went back inside the house. And right then is when the detective flung open his car door, and as quickly as he could, he darted across the street towards the house, but instead of going in to confront this person, he just grabbed their trash bags at the curb. Then, with these bags, he ran back to his car, stuffed the bags in his trunk, and he drove away. And as he drove away, he knew he was about to solve his murder case. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the follow button's home and superglue all their doors shut. Okay, let's get into today's story. On May 28, 2000, an 18-year-old woman named Devin Guzman stood on a beach on the island of St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. She squinted her eyes from the sunlight as a tropical breeze blew lightly through her shoulder-length hair. Standing facing her was her girlfriend, Michelle Hetzel, who was also 18 and who was holding a pair of gold and diamond rings in her hand. Devin almost began to tear up as Michelle slipped one of the rings onto her ring finger, and then Devin reached out and did the same, placing the other ring on Michelle's ring finger. Then the young women held hands and recited vows to each other. Now, there was no priest or marriage officiant present, but for Devin, it didn't matter. She was spiritually and emotionally pledging to spend the rest of her life with Michelle. And in this moment, she couldn't imagine she could ever be happier. Their private little makeshift wedding ceremony during their Memorial Day weekend vacation almost felt like a fantasy. St. Croix was hundreds of miles away from Northampton County in Pennsylvania, where Michelle and Devin both lived. Michelle lived in a city called Easton, and Devin lived nearby in Forks Township. But life had been full of exciting changes recently for Devin. In the last 4 months, she'd moved out of her mom's house, gotten her own car, and started a full-time job as a cleaning technician for a company that repaired and restored property damage. And now, getting married to the woman she loved on a beach in the Caribbean felt like a romantic and fitting way to end a whirlwind couple of months. Now, Devin took Michelle's hand, and the two walked through the warm sand to a tourist trap bar to celebrate with some cold drinks. However, after they got a table and the afterglow of exchanging vows began to fade along with the late afternoon sun, reality began to set in for Devin. Getting married to Michelle in a tropical paradise was one thing, but dealing with the repercussions back home from this marriage was going to be something else entirely. It wasn't homophobia that she was worried about. In 2000, there was still some social stigma associated with being a member of the LGBTQ community, but Devin was confident and outspoken, and so this didn't bother her. What Devin was worried about, though, was the very complicated romantic situation that was waiting for her back home. Because despite the fact that Devin had just gotten, spiritually married to Michelle here on this beach, she was actually already living with her other girlfriend, whose name was Carrie Renner. And that wasn't all. Her other girlfriend, Carrie, was actually also married to someone else, a man. Although Carrie and her husband had actually been separated since he had left for the army to go to basic training. But Devin's relationship with Carrie was a lot different than her relationship with her new spiritual wife, Michelle. Devin and Carrie fought a lot, and their fights often became physical. Sometimes the police would have to come to break them up. Devin looked down at the pager clipped to her waist, and she was actually a little surprised that Carrie had not been paging her nonstop. Devin was planning to break up with Carrie as soon as she got home, and she really was not looking forward to the fight that would almost certainly cause. But she decided that, for right now, she wasn't going to think about any of that. Instead, she looked up and clinked her glass against Michelle's, and took a sip of her cocktail. Later that night, Devin and Michelle were relaxing back in their hotel room. They were preparing to head back home the next day, and they were both sad and kind of stressed that their trip was almost over. Because going back home wasn't only going to be complicated for Devin. Michelle also had a difficult set of relationships waiting for her back in Pennsylvania. Just like Devin, Michelle was also married to someone else, a man named Brandon Bloss. Michelle had actually used Brandon's credit card to pay for this St. Croix trip. But, also just like Devin, Michelle was planning on breaking up with Brandon right when they got back home. However, Devin and Michelle had come up with a plan to make their transition into their new life of spiritual marriage together easier. And now, sitting on the hotel bed together, Devin put this plan into action. She picked up the hotel phone and called her father, Rick Guzman, who lived near her in Pennsylvania. When her dad answered, Devin told him about how she and Michelle had just gotten, spiritually married and that she was planning to break up with Carrie. And then she asked if she and Michelle could come move in with him for a bit. Rick immediately said yes, and Devin knew just from the sound of his voice that he was actually thrilled with her news, because he knew all too well that her relationship with Carrie was sort of a nightmare. So Devin thanked her dad and said she loved him very much and hung up. Then she and Michelle went to sleep feeling happy. A few weeks later, at around 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, June 14th, Devin and Michelle were hanging out and drinking at Devin's father's house in Pennsylvania, like they often did these days. However, Devin and Michelle were not actually living there yet, like they had planned to do way back in St. Croix. And this was because neither of them had actually broken up with their other partners yet. or had even told them about their spiritual wedding with each other. I mean, basically, they had kept everybody in the dark. And as this night wore on, and Devin and Michelle drank more and more, this fact started to become a point of contention between them, and they started to bicker. Both of them were mad at the other for not fully committing. And so a little after 9 p.m., Devin and Michelle each left the house feeling really mad, and they got into their own cars and they drove off to their own homes. A few minutes later, Devin stumbled drunkenly up the stairs and towards the door of the apartment that she still shared with Carrie that was right above a bar in Forks Township. She paused before she walked in. She was dreading the confrontation she knew was waiting for her inside. Devin looked down at the palm of her hand, at a cut that had not quite finished healing yet. Only weeks earlier, after she had come home from St. Croix, she had tried to tell Carrie she did want to break up, but before she could say very much, Carrie had threatened to kill herself with a knife. And then when Devin had tried to wrestle that knife out of her hands, Devin had gotten this big cut on her hand, which required a trip to the emergency room. And so eventually, Devin took a deep breath, then reached down and turned the doorknob and walked inside. As expected, Carrie was waiting, and she was very upset. Devin couldn't hide the fact that clearly she had been out drinking, and also she couldn't hide who she had been out drinking with. And so naturally, they began to argue. And for the first time, Devin told Carrie that she and Michelle had exchanged wedding rings during their trip to St. Croix, and this made Carrie fly into a rage. And so she hit Devin, and Devin hit her right back. And then before it could turn into a full-blown physical altercation, Devin's pager suddenly went off. She picked it up and saw that Michelle had actually been paging her nonstop. She just hadn't noticed. And so quickly, she just walked away from Carrie and went into another room to call Michelle. And then a few minutes later, she just came back into the living room where Carrie was still standing there fuming. And Devin told Carrie that, hey, Michelle's not feeling well, and so I'm going to go over to her house and check on her. And Carrie was sort of caught off guard and just said, well, I'm going with you. And Devin, not wanting to argue anymore or have this escalate any further, told Carrie that fine, she could come as long as she stayed in the car the whole time. So at around 10:30 p.m., Devin pulled her car up to Michelle's house in Easton with Carrie sitting in the passenger seat. Devin reminded Carrie to remain where she was, and then Devin got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Devin knocked, and Michelle's husband, Brandon, answered. And unsurprisingly, he said he would not let Devin inside. However, the reason he gave was because his wife, Michelle, was upset that Devin had come here with Carrie. And so he told Devin that if you want to come inside, you first have to bring Carrie home. And so Devin just turned around, walked back to her car, got inside, and informed Carrie that she was going to have to drive her back home and that she really didn't want to fight about it. And surprisingly, Carrie just sort of agreed because she didn't want to fight either. And at around 11:30 p.m., Devin dropped her off back at the Forks Township apartment. Devin did go into the apartment with Carrie for a little while, but then at about 12:15 a.m., she went back outside and left to return to Michelle's place. About 30 minutes later, around 12:45 a.m. on that Friday morning, the phone at Devin and Carrie's apartment began to ring. Carrie answered and heard Michelle's voice on the other line. And Michelle sounded really upset. She was demanding to know where Devin was. Carrie told Michelle to slow down here. She said Devin wasn't home because she had gone to your place. And when Michelle heard that, her voice turned frantic. She told Carrie that Devin had not returned to her house that evening, and that she'd been paging Devin over and over again, but Devin still had not called her back. Now, to Carrie, this seemed like classic Devin behavior. Devin had a habit of storming off dramatically and disappearing for a while and not talking to anybody, but she always came back. And so Carrie tried to reassure Michelle that, Devin would turn up soon. However, trying to reassure Michelle only made Michelle mad. Michelle began accusing Carrie of lying and started insisting that Devin must be with Carrie right now, and that Carrie was selfishly keeping Devin from seeing her. Then, very abruptly, Carrie heard Michelle slam the receiver down to hang up the phone. Carrie thought that was going to be the end of it, but about an hour and a half later, at about 2:30 in the morning, there was a loud knock on her door. And when Carrie answered, she found herself face to face with Michelle. And just as Michelle had done over the phone, she once again began to aggressively accuse Carrie of literally hiding Devin in the apartment. But Carrie told Michelle she had nothing to hide. And to prove it, she let Michelle come in and look around for Devin. Carrie figured, once Michelle searched her apartment, she would chill out and realize Carrie was honestly telling the truth here, but Michelle did not chill out. Instead, after searching the apartment and not finding Devin, Michelle took out her phone and called 911. Hours later, still on that Friday morning, Carrie woke up in bed, where she'd finally collapsed after being awake most of the night. The cops had come to her place after Michelle called 911, but they seemed totally uninterested in the fact that Devin could be missing. And since it hadn't been 24 hours since she'd been seen or heard from, they really couldn't even file a missing persons report. Instead, the cops issued what's called an attempt to locate report, which, as far as Carrie could tell, was basically the same thing, but just way less urgent. And before Carrie could even begin to sort out all her thoughts, there was another knock on her door. And so Carrie got up and she opened it up, and once again, there was Michelle. And she looked like she literally hadn't slept. And then she would say that, yep, she'd been up all night and all morning just calling Devin's pager over and over again and just not getting an answer. Carrie rubbed her eyes and told Michelle to please calm down, that she was just making herself crazy here. But Michelle ignored her and suggested they should both drive around together and see if they could literally just go find Devin, since it was obvious the cops were not going to be much help here. Carrie did not really want to go drive around with Michelle, but she figured, at the very least, it would get Michelle out of her apartment. So Carrie got dressed and got into Michelle's car, and the two of them drove around town, scouting all the usual places they would go to with Devin. But realistically, Carrie was barely paying attention. She thought the whole thing was a big waste of time and that Devin was sure to turn up soon on her own. That is, until around 1 p.m., when they arrived at a place called Canal Park, which was this gravel parking lot in Easton right next to a river. Because as they pulled into the lot, Carrie saw Devin's car, a silver Pontiac Sunfire with a rainbow sticker on the bumper. And so as soon as Michelle came to a stop, Carrie jumped out of the car and ran over to Devin's car and tried to open the door, but it was locked. She banged on the window in frustration and tried to look inside, but the windows were too tinted so she couldn't see anything. But then she remembered she actually had a spare key in her pocket. So she pulled it out, unlocked the door, opened it up, and when she did, she screamed. A half an hour later, Detective Barry Golozeski of the Easton Police Department stepped out of his cruiser at Canal Park. As he slipped under the yellow police tape that cordoned off the area, Golozeski mentally ran through what dispatch had told him. 2 women had discovered the body of their friend, another young woman named Devin Guzman. He looked over and saw 2 crying women in the park, and figured those must be the 2 women who found the body. Golozeski just shook his head. Easton was not the kind of place where you would expect to find a dead teenager in a parking lot. Nonetheless, he walked over to the car to get a look for himself, peering in through the open rear door. Devin's body was curled up on the back seat, facing the rear of the car and covered by a green jacket. He slipped on a pair of disposable gloves and went in for a closer look. He peeled back the jacket, and right away he saw a gaping wound on the front of Devin's neck. But he noticed right away that there was very little blood for such a major injury. And her clothes weren't covered in blood either, which is what he would have expected. Instead, he just saw dirt and grass stains. He scanned the interior of the car and saw that it too was pretty clean, although one of the floor mats was missing. But the strangest detail was what Devin had clenched in her hand. She was holding a kitchen knife. Something about this didn't sit right to Golozeski. The knife in Devin's hand seemed to suggest she might have cut her own throat, but slitting your throat was a horrible way to die. Besides, there was almost no blood, barely any in the car and none on the knife. So to Golozeski, he felt like this was not a suicide. This was a murder staged to look like a suicide. Just then, the coroner's car pulled into the gravel lot, signaling to the detective that it was time for him to get a move on. Golozeski grabbed a cop standing nearby and told him to have both Devin's car and the car her friends had been driving when they found her impounded immediately. Devin's car for obvious reasons, but the friend's car as well, because the women had driven it so close to the crime scene. Then Golozeski walked over to the 2 hysterical friends of his victim and told them he would give them a ride to the police station to get their statements. Around 3 p.m. that afternoon, Golozeski walked into an interview room at Easton Police Headquarters and sat down across from Carrie, who had been crying so much that her eyes were red and bloodshot and her voice was hoarse. Goloszewski started with the basics, asking Carrie how long she'd been friends with Devin. Now, in a homicide investigation, Goloszewski knew that everyone connected to the victim starts off as a suspect. But neither Carrie nor the other friend, Michelle, seemed particularly suspicious, at least to him so far. That was until Carrie started talking. Because right away, she explained to Goloszewski that she and Devin were not just friends. They were actually in a relationship together. Although she admitted she was also technically married to somebody else too. And Carrie didn't stop there. She told Goloszewski that Michelle, the other friend who had been there when they found the body, was also in a relationship with Devin. But like Carrie, Michelle was also married to someone else, another man, and she was living with him. Goloszewski could barely keep this straight, but he also just couldn't believe what he was hearing. In the first 5 minutes of his interview, he already had a list of 4 people: Carrie, her husband, Michelle, and Michelle's husband, who were all romantically linked to the victim. The potential for jealous rivalries here was through the roof, and so they were definitely all suspects. And so they were all going to need an alibi. So Goloszewski told Carrie to slow down and asked her about the last time she had seen Devin. Carrie took a deep, calming breath. Then she said that she and Devin had been fighting recently because Carrie was really upset about Devin's ongoing relationship with Michelle. She said that Michelle and Devin had recently gone to St. Croix together, and it just really upset Carrie. Goloszewski nodded, but inside he was thinking this is sort of like textbook jealous rivalry here. However, Carrie went on to say that their most recent fight had not been as bad as some of their other fights. She admitted that on other occasions when they got into fights, that she and Devin would get physical. But most recently, she said their fight had just been them yelling at each other. And then, after this heated argument, Carrie said she had actually gone with Devin to Michelle's house, where Michelle's husband had told Devin to take Carrie back home again. And so Carrie said Devin came back to the car and did drive her back to the apartment, and she got dropped off at about 11:30 p.m. And then Devin left again a little while later to presumably go back to Michelle's. But apparently she hadn't made it there because Michelle had called asking Carrie, where is Devin? And she said, I thought she was with you. When Carrie finished, Goloszewski just sat there, trying to make sense of this very complicated story she had just told him. Of all the romantic partners in Devin's life, it seemed to Goloszewski that Carrie was, physically at least, the closest to her, given that they lived together. And so that put her pretty high up on the suspect list. But on the other hand, she was being extremely candid about the ugly side of their relationship, which made him think, she might not be trying to hide anything. After Goloszewski wrapped up the interview, he told Carrie she could go. Then Goloszewski walked out of the room, wondering what more his victim's other girlfriend could possibly have to say. But when Goloszewski sat down to speak with Michelle, Devin's other girlfriend, the other friend who found the body, he immediately sensed that this was going to be a very different kind of interview. Carrie had been almost shockingly honest, but Michelle seemed far less interested in talking much at all about her personal life. She downplayed her relationship with Devin, saying that while they had been romantically involved in high school, they were just friends now. So typically, a person lying about their romantic affiliation with a murder victim was a huge red flag for Goloszewski. But this case was a bit different. In the year 2000, being gay or bisexual was not as widely accepted as it is today. And so it was actually more surprising to Goloszewski that Carrie had been so open about it than it was that Michelle was sort of trying to downplay it. And so he didn't press Michelle too hard on her romantic relationship with Devin. And besides, Michelle seemed to have a lot to say about Carrie. Michelle told Goloszewski that when Devin did not return to her house after dropping off Carrie on the night she disappeared, Michelle called Carrie to find out where Devin was. But Carrie had sounded totally unconcerned. And then, when Michelle had literally gone to Carrie's house to look for Devin, she said the only reaction Carrie had about the whole situation was just irritation. Michelle said she had been the one to insist on calling 911, like we don't know where Devin is, we have to do something. But then when the police showed up, they didn't really take it seriously, which was upsetting, but what was even more upsetting was apparently Carrie's reaction to all this. Michelle told Goloszewski that Carrie basically didn't care and had even tried to talk Michelle out of calling the police in the first place, like she just didn't seem to care about Devin. After that, Michelle asked Goloszewski if Carrie had told him about the fight where Carrie had stabbed Devin in the hand. And Goloszewski just shook his head and said no. And so she told Goloszewski everything Devin had told her about that particular incident. And then at the end of telling the story, she told the detective that really that ordeal kind of summed up Devin and Carrie's relationship. And all of this did make Goloszewski more suspicious of Carrie, but then again, this whole four-way romantic relationship just generally seemed highly suspicious to Goloszewski. It was hard to try to sort out which of Devin's married girlfriends was lying about what and why. After wrapping up with Michelle, Goloszewski had just one more interview to conduct that afternoon, and that was actually speaking to Michelle's husband, Brandon Bloss. Some uniformed officers had gone to Michelle's house while Goloszewski was talking to Carrie and Michelle and brought Brandon in. And so after leaving Michelle, Goloszewski went to find Brandon. At this point, he didn't know what to expect. And for a second, when he entered the final interview room, he got excited. Because Brandon was sitting there sweating profusely and looking incredibly uncomfortable. And Goloszewski's first thought was that, boy, he must be nervous. But then, Goloszewski took in what Brandon was actually wearing, which was a long-sleeve shirt and jeans in the middle of summer, inside of a tiny interview room with no windows and weak air conditioning. And so quickly, his excitement disappeared. Brandon was not nervous, he was just hot. The whole interview with Brandon turned out to be pretty unhelpful. He seemed to have no idea that his wife was romantically involved with Devin, and he also didn't know about their trip to St. Croix. In fact, he said that Michelle had told him that she'd gone on a business trip to San Francisco, not to a tropical island on vacation with Devin. Now, it was possible that Brandon could be pretending not to know anything about his wife's relationship with Devin, but given how tight-lipped Michelle herself had been with the detective, Goloszewski was inclined to think that Brandon might really be in the dark here. Eventually, Goloszewski told Brandon he could go home, and once he was gone, the detective just sat by himself in the interview room, thinking over his entire suspect list. He had already ruled out Carrie's estranged husband pretty much as soon as he had run his name through the system, because what he found is he was in the military and living 250 miles away on a base in New York. And Michelle's husband, Brandon, didn't seem very promising either, since he appeared to be basically clueless about his wife's romantic dynamic. However, Carrie and Michelle, on the other hand, seemed like real possibilities. So, Goloszewski wrote out 2 applications for search warrants, one for the apartment Carrie shared with Devin, and one for the home where Michelle lived with Brandon. Goloszewski was pretty sure Devin had not been killed where her body was found, and he figured with one of these searches, he'd find the real murder scene. So far, the investigation had been moving extremely fast, and to Goloszewski's delight, he was able to get both warrants granted right away, so the momentum continued. Late on the same night that Devin's body had been found, 2 teams of crime scene technicians descended on the 2 properties and began searching for evidence. Goloszewski went first to the home where Devin had lived with Carrie. And the first thing he noticed was the place was in shambles. Furniture was overturned and strewn about, like a very intense fight had taken place there. In the bathroom, a few members of the forensics team had found what appeared to be a car's floor mat in the shower, just like the floor mat that was missing from Devin's car. And so the running theory became amongst the people on the scene that the mat was there because clearly it was being washed, and probably recently. And so Goloszewski watched as someone from forensics sprayed the shower floor beneath the mat with luminol, a chemical compound used by law enforcement to detect blood. And immediately, the area that was sprayed began to glow blue, suggesting that there was indeed the presence of blood either on that floor mat or in the shower. Now, the luminol test was not 100% accurate, but at this point, for Goloszewski, it was good enough. And so as he stood there looking at the glowing bathroom floor, he realized he might very well be standing in the home of his killer. By the time Goloszewski made it over to Michelle and Brandon's house to check on how the search was going over there, it was past midnight, so he was tired, but he was also feeling pretty good about the state of his case. And initially, when a crime scene tech began walking him through Michelle and Brandon's home, he felt even better. Because there was no blood at all inside of Michelle and Brandon's house. There was no sign of a fight either. But then, the crime scene tech told Goloszewski that they had found some blood with the luminol test out in the backyard, on a pool cover and on the nozzle of a hose. Goloszewski frowned. Until this moment, he had felt lucky to have found blood in one suspect's home. Now he had blood in both the homes where all his suspects lived, making this thing even more confusing. Now, he was fairly certain that Carrie, Michelle, and Brandon had not all worked together to kill Devin, and even if they had, they wouldn't result in two separate murder scenes miles apart. Goloszewski checked his watch, and he saw that at this point, he'd been awake for almost 24 hours. And so he decided to let the crime scene unit finish processing both homes and go get some sleep. He'd come back fresh in the morning, and hopefully then, things would look clearer. When Goloszewski walked into his office the next day on June 16th, so one full day after Devin Guzman's body had been found, he found her autopsy report waiting for him on his desk, and it was gruesome. The wound to Devin's throat was a 4-inch-long cut that went almost all the way to her spine. The cut had severed her tongue and also sliced in half both her right carotid artery and also her right jugular vein. When the coroner originally pulled her body from the car, they thought for a moment that her head had actually been completely cut off. Devin had lost almost all the blood in her body before she was placed in the car. So Goloszewski had been right, that she had been killed somewhere else, like Carrie's shower or maybe Michelle's backyard. But as he continued reading, he realized he had been wrong about something else. The coroner had put Devin's time of death somewhere between midnight and 3 a.m. Until this moment, Goloszewski still thought that Carrie was his best suspect. But now he thought of something. Carrie didn't have a car. To kill Devin and leave her at Canal Park, Carrie would have had to walk 8 miles back to her apartment, which would have taken at least 3 hours. And so obviously she had not done that because she had been at home when Michelle showed up looking for Devin at 2:30 a.m. And so suddenly, Michelle was looking a lot better as Goloszewski's killer. And that's when Goloszewski's desk phone rang. An officer on the other line told the detective that he had the strange caller on hold, and that this guy was saying really weird stuff about the Devin Guzman case. The officer said he would patch him through. Goloszewski dropped the stack of papers on his desk and picked up a pen just in time to hear the voice of a man who introduced himself as George Vine Jr. The man said he was a friend of Devin and Michelle, and a few months ago, Michelle had offered him sex or money to, quote, get rid of Devin. Now, at the time, he said he just laughed it off because he knew how volatile Devin and Michelle's relationship could be, and he figured this was just more of that. But now that Devin was dead, he wasn't so sure. And now, neither was Goloszewski. And so Goloszewski now had a whole new theory for this case, with Michelle, not Carrie, at the center. But almost immediately, he started running into new problems. George Vine Jr.'s story sounded like a slam dunk, but when another detective went to take his statement, he found that it was actually months old and pretty vague, and that Vine had no corroborating evidence. And as Goloszewski and his team began the painstaking process of conducting interviews with every family member, friend, and neighbor of Devin's they could find, more cracks formed in the Michelle theory. 2 separate sets of interviews threw Goloszewski off. The first set was with Michelle and Brandon's neighbors. They told police that Michelle and Brandon fought with each other constantly, and that, contrary to what Brandon had told Goloszewski, he did know about Michelle and Devin's relationship, and he wasn't happy about it. And one of these 2 neighbors had actually heard Brandon arguing with Devin on the same night Devin was killed. And so this made Goloszewski think that he should be looking more closely at Brandon. However, the second set of interviews muddied the waters even further and pointed him right back at Carrie. Because her neighbors said that on the night of the murder, they heard fighting too. Now, Goloszewski already knew that Carrie and Devin had fought because Carrie herself had told him this, but Carrie had claimed that the last time she saw Devin was at about 12:15 a.m. when Devin left to head to Michelle's. Her neighbors, though, said differently. One woman said after hearing this fight, she had walked past their apartment at about 1:30 a.m., and she saw that the front door was open. And inside, she said that she could see this woman laying on a couch wearing a green jacket. This was obviously significant because when Devin's body was found, she was being covered by a green jacket. If what this woman said was true, it meant Carrie lied about when Devin left her apartment. The final complicating piece of evidence arrived late that afternoon. The crime scene techs had tested the blood found at both Carrie and Devin's apartment and Michelle and Brandon's apartment. The blood that was found in Michelle and Brandon's yard couldn't be matched to anyone because it was too diluted. But the blood in Carrie's shower was a match for Devin. Less than 1 week into his murder case, Goloszewski now had 3 suspects. They all had motive and opportunity. And they had all lied to him. And Goloszewski had witness statements and physical evidence that made all of them look guilty. But Goloszewski knew they didn't all murder Devin, and he was stumped as to how to figure out which one did. Devin's funeral was held on June 21st, 6 days after her murder. 400 people attended her funeral. And right around that day, Goloszewski and his team sat down with all their files and went back to square one. They went through every interview, every piece of physical evidence, every observation that any of them had made during their investigation so far, and as they did this, they ended up stumbling upon this sort of unusual plan that they believed would point them to their killer. On June 28th, about a week and a half after Devin Guzman was killed, Detective Goloszewski sat in an unmarked police car parked on the side of a street. It was a Wednesday, which was important, because Wednesday was trash day, and Goloszewski was waiting for one of his suspects to leave their home and bring their trash to the curb, because their trash was not just trash. In Goloszewski's eyes, it was evidence. And in the state of Pennsylvania, once someone puts their trash out on the curb for collection, the trash is no longer considered private, and so the cops don't need a search warrant to go sifting through it. This kind of curbside search is called a trash pull. So now, Goloszewski was betting on bags of trash to close this case. Eventually, his suspect emerged carrying their trash, they put it on the side of the road, and Goloszewski waited until they were back inside their home. Then he climbed out of his car, grabbed the trash, put it in his trunk, and drove to the police station. Once inside headquarters, Goloszewski brought the trash bags into an evidence room, ripped them open, and dumped their contents out on a table. And then he began the very dirty work of sorting through all the smelly junk, the rotting food, the discarded receipts, the coffee grinds, the wet paper towels, and balled up clumps of newspaper. But then, right as he reached the end of the bag, he found something. This discovery would trigger the police to exhume Devin's body and look inside of her mouth. And once they did this, they had their killer. Based on evidence collected by the Easton Police Department over the course of a nearly 2-month investigation, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Devin Guzman in the early hours of June 15, 2000. Devin Guzman had actually left her killer's home, but she eventually came back. And when the killer saw her, all the rage they'd been feeling for weeks exploded, and the killer lunged at Devin. But Devin fought back, and for a brief moment, Devin escaped their killer and began to walk away, but the killer took the moment that Devin's back was turned to come up behind her with a knife, and they reached around and they viciously slit her throat. Then, after Devin had bled to death, the killer dragged Devin's body to Devin's own car. She put her body in the back seat, along with a decoy knife in her hand, and then the killer drove the car all the way to Canal Park and left it there. Now, the killer might have gotten away with it, except for the bite mark. They didn't even realize Devin had left during the fight. And the reason they didn't realize it is because Devin did not bite the killer. She bit the killer's accomplice. And the accomplice, not really realizing how significant that bite mark was, had just dressed the wound as if it was just any other wound. They'd put gauze and bandages over the bite mark. And unfortunately for them, but fortunately for law enforcement, those bandages, when they were discarded in their trash, well, police were able to actually see the bite mark on the bandage. It retained the bite mark and gave away that's what it had been dressed over. Now, Goloszewski might have noticed the bite mark on the accomplice's arm when he interviewed them, except the accomplice was wearing long sleeves in the middle of the summer. The killer was Michelle, and her accomplice was her husband, Brandon. The blood identified in Carrie's bathroom was indeed Devin's, but it had not come from her murder. She had simply bled in the shower, naturally, just close to the time that she was killed. The car mat turned out to not have any blood on it at all. Instead, it was stained with pickled beet juice, which Devin or Carrie had coincidentally tried to wash off in the shower. Devin's body was covered in dirt and grass stains because she was likely killed outside, in the backyard of Michelle and Brandon's home. As for the eyewitness who saw Devin on the couch at Carrie's house on the night of the murder, they were simply mistaken about the time. Both Michelle and Brandon were arrested in August of 2000. They each blamed the other for the actual killing, although prosecutors presented evidence that suggests Michelle had been wielding the knife. On October 5th, 2001, both Michelle and Brandon were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. They later divorced. As for Carrie, she was completely exonerated and actually wound up reuniting with her estranged husband. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Zeth Lundy. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the Mr. Ballin podcast, as well as Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. The man's cousin had been gunned down just 2 days earlier in a horrible double homicide that shocked the little town of Mountain City, Tennessee. And now, on February 2nd, 2012, the detectives wanted this man's help. But the man just slouched down in his chair, muttering one-word answers and never even taking off his sunglasses. So eventually, the detectives just stopped asking questions and just stared at the man, waiting for him to talk when he was ready. And at some point, the man did talk, but he said something that didn't make any sense. He sat up suddenly and looked all around the room like somebody was watching him, and then he looked at the two detectives, and he said very quietly, "Is the CIA here?" The detectives had no idea why the American spy agency would be interested in a Tennessee murder case, but now they needed to find out. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to take the Amazon Music follow button out to the movies, and then while you're there, be sure to sprinkle an entire handful of sand onto their popcorn, but tell them it's salt. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was after 11 p.m. on January 30th, 2012, when Billy Payne Jr. got a call. A buddy of his wanted to come to his house in Mountain City, Tennessee to buy some drugs. But Billy didn't appreciate getting that call. Sure, Billy was a small-time drug dealer, but he wasn't the crazy bachelor he used to be a few years earlier. He was 36, and he had a family now, including a 6-month-old son who had finally fallen asleep. And so the last thing Billy needed was a late-night visitor to wake the baby up again. So, at 11:30, he texted his friend saying they couldn't meet up. He explained he had to be up early in the morning for his job at the thread factory, and so he needed some rest. His friend would just have to get his pills somewhere else. But as much as this call was annoying because it was inconveniencing, the truth was Billy was actually in the process of trying to leave his drug-abusing past behind. Billy had always been the life of the party in his small town. He was the guy who always had a beer in his hand and an endless parade of girlfriends. He drove a Mustang and bragged about going to Las Vegas for the weekend. His cousin, Jamie Curd, described Billy as being a man with caviar tastes on a working man's budget. But all that high living had a price. Billy had developed a nasty addiction to opioid painkillers, an addiction that he supported in part by selling opioids himself. Billy knew he'd made his share of mistakes in his life, including the fact that he had a young son in Florida that he never saw, but his opioid addiction was the worst. It clouded his judgment, it sucked up his money, and always left him feeling desperate for more. After Billy finished texting his friend, telling him not to come over, he went to go peek in on his baby, Tyler, who was all tucked into his crib. Billy smiled at the baby, and then he headed down the hall to join his girlfriend, Billie Jean Hayworth, in bed. Billie Jean was 13 years younger than Billy, and she was slender and pretty, with short brown hair. She was also an outdoorsy Tennessee girl who loved nothing better than fishing, hiking, and camping. Billy had had his eye on Billie Jean from the moment she had come to work on the cleaning crew at the thread factory 3 years earlier, and soon after they had met, the two started spending all their time together. By 2010, Billy had invited Billie Jean to move into the small one-bathroom house that he shared with his father. By 2011, Billie Jean was pregnant with Billy's child. That same year, Billy had begun going religiously to an opioid treatment center and taking a prescription drug to control his cravings. And while the new year was still only a few weeks old, Billy still had a feeling that this year, 2012, would be the year he could finally start calling himself a former opioid addict. Billy felt grateful as he looked down at his sleeping girlfriend, but he didn't look for long. He was really tired, and as soon as he laid down and his head hit the pillow, he fell asleep. But parents of infants rarely get to sleep for very long, and just after 5 a.m., baby Tyler started wailing from his crib. Billie Jean wearily swung her feet out of the bed and onto the floor, and then set off down the hall to try to calm the baby down. Billy woke up to all the commotion, and he lay there quietly, listening to the sounds of Billie Jean heating up a bottle for Tyler. He could also hear another voice out in the kitchen. It was his father. Sometimes the house felt a bit cramped, with all of them living there together, but it filled Billy with happiness to watch his father hold little Tyler. After a few minutes, Billy heard Billie Jean changing the baby's diaper, and he heard his father saying goodbye and leaving for work. Then Billy felt Billie Jean slide back into bed next to him, and then he began to nod off again, even though he knew the alarm would soon wake him up. And it was at this point that Billy heard the sound of the sliding glass side door open. Just for a moment, he thought maybe his father must have forgotten something and come back. But then a shadowy figure suddenly loomed in the bedroom doorway, standing there completely silent and still. And even in the darkness, he could tell this was not his father. Billy suddenly was terrified, and he managed to blurt out, "What the hell?" And then everything went black. Less than an hour later, at 6:25 a.m., a friend of Billy's pulled into Billy's driveway, just like he always did on weekdays. He worked at the thread factory with Billy, and they usually carpooled. From outside, the friend could see that Billy and Billie Jean's bedroom light was on, but the friend didn't want to burst in, so he sent Billy a text, asking if he was going to work today. When Billy didn't respond, his friend went around the side of the house, and then went into the house through the sliding glass door that Billy and Billie Jean always left unlocked. He called out for Billy, but got no answer, so he used the family's landline phone in the living room to call Billy's cell phone twice. But each time, no one picked up. But just then, the friend wondered if maybe the reason Billy and Billie Jean were not responding to him was because they were sharing a private, intimate moment in their bedroom, and basically the friend had walked in on them. And so out of respect, the friend just stopped what he was doing, left the house, and figured, Billy would be in touch at some point. Almost 4 hours later, another family friend, whose name was Roy Stevens, came to Billy and Billie Jean's house to pick up some mail that Billy and Billie Jean were holding for him. And just like the friend from earlier, Roy also ended up going into their house through the unlocked glass sliding door and began calling out for Billie Jean and Billy. And when no one responded, Roy walked down the hall to the couple's bedroom and went inside. And what he saw gave him the shock of his life. Billy was lying on his back on the bed, not moving and covered in blood. Roy ran to Billy and shook his arm, but it was useless. Billy was totally lifeless. Roy began screaming, "No, no, no," over and over and over again. Then he rushed outside and yelled for his wife, who was waiting in the car, to call 911. Then Roy went back inside, and he would make an even more shocking discovery. He heard a murmur coming from the baby's bedroom, and when he went into that bedroom, he saw Billie Jean lying on the floor in a pool of blood. And there in her arms was her baby, breathing but asleep. The baby's forehead was smeared with their mother's blood. Roy couldn't believe what he was looking at, but he just reached down and scooped up the child, and then ran out of the house as fast as he could. Minutes later, paramedics reached the house, but there wasn't anything they could do for Billie and Billie Jean. The EMTs said the couple had likely been dead for hours. This was now a job for homicide detectives. Agent Scott Lott, a veteran detective with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, was one of the first law enforcement officials on the scene, and he began photographing everything he saw. He knew immediately that this was not your typical East Tennessee murder that grew out of an alcohol-fueled argument or a domestic dispute. This was something more sinister. It looked like Billy had been shot with a single bullet before he could even get out of bed, and he also had this deep gash on his throat. Lott left the bedroom and walked down the hall to the nursery, and he saw Billie Jean lying on the floor by her baby's crib. She had also been shot with a single bullet. Lott knew she had to have been killed while she was clutching her baby, and the thought of that was so disturbing and just so sad. Lott got down on his hands and knees and began to look for the actual bullet that killed Billie Jean, and he found it lodged in the baby's bouncy seat. Lott was amazed that the baby had somehow been left unhurt in all of this carnage. Aside from the murder victims themselves, Lott felt like the house seemed remarkably undisturbed. There was no sign of a struggle or a robbery or destruction of Billy and Billie Jean's property. Whoever committed these murders was very clean and efficient. After Lott's initial search of the house, he walked outside and waited for Billy's father to come home. Billy's father choked back sobs when he came roaring up to the house in his truck. He had gotten a call from a sheriff's deputy telling him what had happened at his house. He stepped out of the truck, and Detective Lott went over to meet him. Billy's father told Lott that everything had seemed perfectly normal when he left that morning. Billie Jean had been feeding the baby in the pre-dawn darkness, and he was getting ready for work. And now, just a few hours later, his whole property was marked off with yellow police tape, and his son and his son's girlfriend were dead. The old man just couldn't make any sense of it. But as Lott listened to Billy's distraught father, it dawned on him that the killer or killers must have planned the attack in great detail. Billy's dad said he left for work at 5:30 a.m., and Billy needed to go to work an hour later. That left only 1 hour when Billy and Billie Jean would have been home alone with the baby. Lott thought the chances were good that the killer or killers had been waiting in the dark outside the house for their opportunity to attack this young couple, and the thought of that just made Lott's skin crawl. By 2 p.m., the detectives were ready to release the bodies to the morgue for autopsy, and Lott was eager to start talking to people who knew the victims. His investigators had combed every square inch of the house and learned almost nothing from it. Lott didn't know whether he was dealing with a drug cartel hit or a serial killer or something else entirely. That afternoon, Lott and his partner, Chief Deputy Joe Woodard, asked one of Billie Jean's closest friends, Lindsay Thomas, to come down to the Mountain City Sheriff's Station. They hoped she might be able to provide some information about Billie Jean that could help the investigation. Lindsay had clearly been crying, but she came to the station ready to help find the killer or killers, even if that meant telling some of her friends' secrets. Lindsay said she suspected that the murders had something to do with drugs. She had visited Billie Jean at home the day before the killings, and Billie Jean had told her that she was selling opioid pills to help pay for Tyler's baby supplies. And Lindsay knew that Billie Jean's boyfriend, Billy, also sold opioid pills. And so Lindsay told Lott that between the two of them, they could have been in touch with some very dangerous people who would not hesitate to hurt or even kill them if something went wrong. This was news to Lott. Billy and Billie Jean did not have criminal records, and they were not under investigation by the narcotics squad either. But maybe the couple was just good at avoiding unwanted attention. The crime scene was certainly consistent with a ruthless drug gang hit, cold, efficient, and cruel, and Lott did find white crystals on the floor in Tyler's room that looked a lot like methamphetamines. and so Lot made a mental note to be sure to check back in with his narcotics squad. Then, Lot asked about something Billy's dad had told him. When Billy's dad was sobbing in front of the house, he had made a comment about how there was some bad blood between his son and his son's girlfriend and this other family in town, the Potters. Now, Billy's father was too upset to explain this clearly, but from what Lot gathered, it sounded like there was some sort of internet feud between primarily Billie Jean and Janelle Potter, who was 30 years old and lived with her parents. Lindsay told detectives that she knew all about this feud. She said she'd even gotten caught up in it. But she thought the whole thing was just stupid. It was more like a middle school food fight than a reason to actually kill someone, and so Billy and Billie Jean were not afraid of the Potter family. I mean, they never even locked all their doors. Still, Lot asked Lindsay to slow down and walk the detectives through the entire feud. Lindsay said the dispute had begun more than a year earlier when people that she had never heard of began slamming her and Billie Jean on a website called Topics. It was a site where people commented on local issues, sometimes anonymously. One person had accused Lindsay of threatening to hurt Janelle, and he said that Janelle's defenders might hurt Lindsay too. And so he warned Lindsay to, quote, watch her back. For months, Topics users alleged that Lindsay and Billie Jean were out to get Janelle, and that they might even physically assault her. Lindsay told the detectives that she and Billie Jean had tried to ignore the taunts because the whole idea was absurd. The two women barely knew Janelle and really had no reason to want to hurt her. Lindsay said that she and Billie Jean ultimately became convinced that Janelle Potter herself was orchestrating these social media posts against them as a way to make herself look like a victim and maybe get some sympathy. Lindsay explained that Janelle was a very immature person who had never had a job, never had a driver's license, or really a real boyfriend, so she had plenty of time to stir up some trouble. Lindsay said that she and Billie Jean eventually filed harassment charges against Janelle, but a judge threw out their complaints for lack of evidence. After that, Billy got involved, and he called Janelle's mother in hopes of ending the dispute. But the mother stood by her daughter, and before long, the phone call had turned into a shouting match with Janelle crying in the background. Lot looked over at his partner Woodard, and he nodded. They both knew this was a strange lead, but it was the best thing they had so far, so they had to go talk to the Potters next. The next morning, so February 1st, the two detectives drove out to the Potters' home, located a few miles from where Billy and Billie Jean had lived and died. Janelle's father, Buddy, opened the front door even before Lot and Woodard could ring the doorbell. He would tell them that he'd actually been expecting them because everybody in town always pointed fingers at his family. Lot could see that Buddy was a very proud United States Marine. He wore a Marine Corps hat, and his living room table was covered with military honors, including decorations from combat in Vietnam. Buddy said that he and his wife had moved here from Pennsylvania a few years back after a severe fall ended Buddy's military career, and now they were just enjoying retirement. But Buddy acknowledged that their daughter, Janelle, really struggled sometimes. He explained that she had a hearing problem when she was young that made it really difficult for her to carry on normal conversations, and at 6 feet tall, she felt really awkward and struggled to talk to boys. So as the years went by, she spent more and more of her time alone at home. Buddy said that his daughter was so vulnerable that he and his wife often had to be very protective. Anybody who wanted to do something socially with Janelle had to meet Buddy and her mother, Barbara, first. And Buddy said they worried constantly that Janelle was being bullied. That's when Barbara chimed in. She said the feud between their family and Billie Jean and her friends was a perfect example of the way Janelle was bullied. Barbara said that, Billie Jean and Lindsay would pick on Janelle so regularly that she and Buddy sometimes worried that their daughter might end up hurting herself. Janelle sat quietly as her parents talked about her to the detectives. But eventually, Janelle would speak up, and she would say that she didn't understand why Billie Jean and Lindsay were targeting her. She said she never posted insults about Billie Jean or anybody else online, but some of the people who came to Janelle's defense online fiercely criticized Billie Jean and Lindsay. Janelle said she believed that Billie Jean and Billy and Lindsay were trying to make her feel completely alone. She said that Billy had also attacked her closest supporters, falsely accusing her friend, Jamie Curd, of selling drugs. Lot's eyes widened at the mention of Jamie Curd. He'd heard that name when interviewing people who were close to Billy. And so he stopped Janelle and he asked, "Isn't that Billy's cousin?" And Janelle nodded and said, "Yes." Lot acted surprised. Lot told Janelle he understood that Jamie and Billy were not only relatives, but also close friends. So why would Billy attack Jamie? Janelle explained that Jamie actually was no longer friends with his cousin Billy anymore because he had learned how badly Billy and Billie Jean and Lindsay were mistreating Janelle. The two detectives wrapped up the interview and thanked the Potters for their time. Then they got up and walked outside and made their way over to their car, all the while puzzling over the strange story they'd just heard. Also, Janelle's way of talking just seemed very immature to them, and not just because of her high-pitched, childlike voice, but also because she portrayed everything in terms of petty rivalries that really did seem like something from middle school. But the online harassment that Janelle and her parents described sounded very serious to Lot. And if Janelle really did look at the world like a middle school kid, she would be an easy target. So Lot could see why the Potter family was on edge at the mention of Billy and Billie Jean. Lot and Woodard agreed they needed to speak with Billy's cousin, Jamie, as soon as possible. Clearly, he had a ringside seat for the family feud, and so maybe he could give the detectives some sense of how deep the anger ran on both sides. Later that day, narcotics officers listened politely as Agent Lot described the evidence that Billy and Billie Jean were selling drugs out of their home, potentially putting their lives at risk. But the narcotics officers were not impressed. They said at most, Billy and Billie Jean were small-time dealers who were selling just to their inner circle. The narcotics officers went on to say that typically they investigated people who sold hundreds of times more product than Billy and Billie Jean. If anyone was going to get killed over a drug deal gone bad, it would likely be major dealers, not just some random young couple with a little bag of pills. Nothing the narcotics officer said surprised Lot, but the dead end left him with only one real lead in the case. Now he was even more interested in his upcoming conversation with Jamie Curd. By the time Jamie walked into the sheriff's office on Thursday, February 2nd, so 2 days after the murder, the detectives had thoroughly scrubbed his background. They talked to friends of the victims, as well as Jamie's own sister, about Jamie's relationship with Billy and Janelle. People said that Billy was probably the best friend Jamie had ever had. The two men had worked together on the same exact machine at the thread factory, and then they often went out and partied together after the shift was over. And when Jamie's dog died a few years ago, Billy had even come over with beer to commiserate and to comfort his cousin. And when Jamie couldn't find a girlfriend, Billy had introduced him to Janelle Potter, who had just as much trouble getting a date as Jamie did. And Jamie and Janelle hit it off and began spending time together, but they had one problem. Janelle's parents did not like Jamie. At one point, they even banned him from coming inside their house. And so that was when Jamie began offering to come over and repair the Potter family's computers, because it was literally the only way he could think of that he could still see Janelle. But Jamie's relationship with Janelle ultimately drove a wedge between Jamie and his cousin Billy as the online feud spread to Facebook and other social media, and then to the courts. In the end, Jamie had to choose between his girl and his best friend, and he picked his girl, and the two men stopped speaking to each other. Now, the detectives wondered how far Jamie would go to defend Janelle. From the moment Jamie entered the police interview room, with a baseball hat pulled down low over his sleepy eyes, Lot had the sense of a man who was a follower, not a leader. Jamie himself was quick to make it clear that he was a country boy who had never strayed too far from eastern Tennessee. He said he didn't really use computers much himself, even though he was enough of a handyman to repair them, but he knew that Billy and Billie Jean were posting threats against Janelle on Facebook and other websites. And Jamie just couldn't understand why Billy would do that, or why Billy denied that it was true. Jamie said he saw firsthand the damage that Billy and Billie Jean's threats were doing to Janelle. Jamie said he had seen Janelle suffer these paralyzing panic attacks over some of the things that Billy and Billie Jean were saying about her. And Jamie said at some point he just couldn't take it. He just could not bear to watch his girl get hurt. Detective Lot said he could only imagine how hard it would be to watch your girlfriend be bullied. Jamie tried to interrupt, claiming that Janelle was not his girlfriend, but Lot ignored him. He said it must have been hard for Jamie to keep from hurting the people who were hurting Janelle. Then Lot leaned forward and looked right at Jamie, and he asked him a very surprising and blunt question. Would you shoot a woman with a baby in her arms? Startled, Jamie just sat there for a moment before he answered with one word: no. And Jamie instantly offered to take a lie detector test to prove he really had nothing to do with these murders. And after that, he went silent. And so the detectives just sat there in silence and stared at Jamie, hoping he would eventually chime in with useful information. And for a while, all Jamie did was just sit slouched in his chair, but then suddenly Jamie sat up and he began wildly looking all around the interview room as though he was looking for someone who was watching them. Then he looked right at the detectives, and his eyes were wide and his voice got really quiet, and he asked them, "Is the CIA here?" Lott and his partner were dumbfounded, but also intrigued. Why would the Central Intelligence Agency, the country's international spy agency, have anything to do with a double murder in rural Tennessee? Jamie glanced from detective to detective, hoping for an answer to his question, but the two detectives didn't say anything, mostly because this was a totally outrageous question that didn't seem legitimate. But what was absolutely clear in this moment was the two detectives knew they had to figure out what in the world Jamie was talking about. On the other side of town, Janelle's mother, Barbara, had no idea that Jamie was talking to the police at that very moment. But she would have known exactly why Jamie was asking about the CIA. And she, for one, was grateful that one particular spy did keep an eye on Mountain City, Tennessee. For more than a year, Barbara had been emailing back and forth with a CIA agent named Chris, and they had grown very close, like mother and son. In fact, she even sometimes addressed him as son. Chris, the CIA agent, had gone to high school with Janelle more than a decade earlier. And even though his career had taken him around the world since those days, he still kept a protective eye on his high school classmate, and he would let Barbara know whenever he learned of any threats to Janelle's safety. Months before the murders, in April of 2011, Chris had emailed Barbara to let her know that Billie Jean and two other women had been prowling around their property at night. Chris said he suspected the women were up to no good, but he was in no position to do anything. He had just broken his arm, and he was in a cast. However, Chris said he had tapped the phone line in Billie and Billie Jean's house, so he would be able to keep track of their conversations. That way, they would know if Billie and Billie Jean were planning anything else. Barbara couldn't thank Chris enough for the warning. He was like a guardian angel. "We love you, son," she wrote back to him. And in the email, she also reassured Chris that her husband, Buddy, was in, quote, Vietnam jungle recon mode, end quote, and he would be ready if any intruders tried to enter their home. Billie's cousin Jamie had also struck up a relationship with Chris, the CIA agent, and Jamie often poured his heart out to the spy about how much he loved Janelle. Chris had assured Jamie that he had a great girl, but he warned Jamie that Billie and Billie Jean and their friends, they really wanted to make Janelle's life hell, and that would definitely affect Jamie's life. So when Jamie returned to the police station to take his lie detector test that he requested on February 6, 2012, so almost a week after the murders, he hoped that Chris, the CIA agent, might be looking out for him. But things didn't go so well for Jamie. The lie detector analyst concluded that Jamie was being deceptive when he claimed he didn't know anything about the murders of Billie and Billie Jean. And so this meant it was very likely that Jamie was hiding something. And this was exactly what Agent Lott was hoping for. Now he'd be able to really up the pressure on Jamie and basically force him to either spill his guts or risk facing first-degree murder charges. And so Agent Lott walked into the interview room where Jamie was once again waiting, and Lott felt ready to break this man down. For the next 2 hours, Lott, along with another detective, threw one question after another at Jamie. What was he hiding? Why was he lying? Was anyone else involved in the murders? And Jamie just sat there mumbling, I don't know, or just grumbling without even answering at all. Finally, the detectives actually started taking pity on Jamie, saying they knew he was not the mastermind. He was probably just following someone else's instructions. Lott said that maybe Jamie didn't shoot anyone, but he needed to tell them who did. But Jamie just continued to mumble and stammer his way, and so Lott was getting really frustrated. So he just left the room and typed up a written statement, a confession for Jamie to sign, that admitted he played a role in the murders. And so Lott came back in the room with the statement, and he slid the confession with a pen across the table to Jamie, and Jamie just stared at it for a long time, doing nothing. But eventually, Jamie picked up the pen and he signed his name down at the bottom. After the interrogation ended, Jamie looked completely defeated, and so he very quickly just agreed to let the detectives come out to the parking lot and search his car. And in his car, scrawled on a scrap of paper on the front passenger seat, the detectives found email addresses for not only Jamie, but also for Barbara and Janelle. This was like a goldmine to Lott. Now that Jamie had confessed to a backup role in the murders, the detectives could get a search warrant to see all the messages written to and from these email addresses in the months leading up to the murders. If there was a larger plot to murder Billy and Billie Jean, then the detectives would soon know about it. A few days later, the email company sent the detectives an electronic file containing thousands of emails sent or received by Jamie, Barbara, and Janelle over the previous year. And so suddenly, the detectives had a window into why the Potter family lived in such fear. The detectives quickly started seeing correspondence from a CIA agent named Chris Chodden, who was warning with increasing urgency that Billy, Billie Jean, and their friends were harassing and threatening Janelle. The emails were chatty and personal, sometimes weaving in stories from Chris's CIA work or references to his 3 Great Danes, but frequently coming back to his concerns that these bullies might follow through on their threats to hurt Janelle. Lott couldn't believe that a CIA agent would use his official position to get involved in a family feud in rural Tennessee. The emails showed that for months in 2011, Chris had tried to get a CIA ID card for Janelle's father, Buddy, so that Buddy could acquire military-grade weapons that are normally off-limits to civilians. And so the whole thing just seemed extremely unprofessional to the detectives. So Lott and another detective decided to track down Chris and just ask him what was going on. The detectives found a guy named Chris Chodden who graduated with Janelle from a high school in Pennsylvania, and so Lott got his phone number and called him up. Chris seemed surprised to be getting a call from police in Tennessee, but he agreed to talk. And the next day, Lott and the other detective drove up from Mountain City to Delaware to meet with Chris for coffee at his house. After the detectives and Chris had taken a seat at the kitchen table, they talked for a few minutes, just kind of general niceties, and then Lott just pushed a stack of papers across the table to Chris and told him they were copies of emails that he had written to his old high school classmate, Janelle Potter. But Chris just looked blankly at the papers and then at the detectives, and he said he had never sent an email to Janelle Potter, ever. He knew her in high school, but they were never really friends and did not stay in touch after graduation. He said he didn't know what those papers were, but they had nothing to do with him. Lott then asked Chris about his work for the CIA, and Chris nearly broke out laughing. The CIA? Chris said he was a police officer, just like the 2 detectives, but he had never had anything to do with the CIA, and he certainly wasn't a spy. Lott asked Chris if he had broken his arm recently, and Chris said he had never broken it. Lott and the other detective believed Chris. He was nothing like the brash CIA agent in the emails, and he seemed genuinely surprised to be asked questions about a woman he barely knew. But now Lott needed to know, if Chris was not the author of all those emails, who was? The emails that the detectives had obtained from their search warrant were enough to fill an entire banker's box when they were printed out, and they included countless emails from Chris himself. But using them to solve a crime was another question altogether. They were not in any particular order, and they covered a wide array of subjects, from everyday trivia like Janelle's love of floppy-eared dogs to Chris's tale of international assassinations. If investigators were going to figure out Chris's true identity, they needed a specialist who could really focus and not be distracted by every twist and turn of the investigation. So they turned to a veteran state prosecutor, Dennis Brooks, who agreed to read every single email until he had a better sense of who Chris really was. For days, Brooks spent his evenings immersed in the electronic world that the Potters and Jamie shared with Chris. Brooks concluded that Chris, if nothing else, wrote like he was a homicidal maniac. In notes to Buddy, Barbara, and Jamie alike, Chris would talk about the need to eliminate Billy and Billie Jean and their friends. He closed one message in particular to the Potters with the words, "Kill, kill, kill," all in capital letters. And of course, Brooks suspected that whoever this person was, this Chris person, they did not work for the CIA. Real CIA operatives, the kind who killed people as part of their job, were notoriously secretive, and Chris was anything but. He seemed to openly brag about his most important assignments. But there was one striking thing about every single one of the notes from Chris that convinced Brooks that the real author, the real Chris, could only be one person. And that person was the mastermind behind the murders of Billy and Billie Jean, using others as unwitting pawns. The night that Jamie Curd signed his confession, he did finally break down and talk in great detail about his role in the murders. Then, once investigators had thoroughly analyzed all the emails, they did have a clear picture of how the murders played out. And so here is a reconstruction of how police believe Billy and Billie Jean were murdered in their home on January 31st. Around midnight on January 31st, so right as Billy was crawling into bed, a few miles away, Billy and Billie Jean's killer told Jamie that they needed a favor from him. Would Jamie take a ride to Billy and Billie Jean's house and stand lookout? Jamie knew what this favor really meant. The killer was finally going to take drastic action against Billy and Billie Jean, and they needed someone else for backup. Jamie did not like this idea, but he had known this night was coming for months, and so he agreed to go. So Jamie and the killer drove to a church that was near Billy and Billie Jean's house, where they could see whoever left or entered, and they waited. Eventually, they saw the light go on as Billie Jean brought her baby into the kitchen for a bottle. Then they saw Billy's father packing his lunch for work, and then walking out the door around 5:30 a.m. This was the moment they were waiting for, when Billy and Billie Jean were all alone with just their baby in the house. Now, the couple was going to get what was coming to them. Jamie and the killer put on gloves, and then the killer gave Jamie a handgun so they'd both be armed. Then the killer and Jamie got out of the car, they made their way over to Billy and Billie Jean's house, and the killer slid open the unlocked glass doors on the side of the house, and then they walked inside and headed straight for Billy and Billie Jean's bedroom. Once the killer reached the bedroom, they stood in the doorway to gather their courage for a moment, and then they entered the room. And as soon as they did, Billy woke up and he yelled out, "What the hell?" But the killer was on top of Billy before he could do anything. And the killer put their gun just inches from Billy's face and fired. At this point, Billie Jean, who's right next to Billy, began to scream and she ran out of the room, but she didn't get far because Jamie was standing guard in front of the door that would lead outside. So Billie Jean couldn't escape. Instead, she ran down the hallway to her baby's room and pulled him out of the crib and held him close to her body. And then the killer just stepped into the room, rushed at Billie Jean, they raised their gun and shot her point blank in the side of the head. Billie Jean crumpled onto the floor, still clutching her baby. The killer simply turned around, walked back into the hall, and headed back to the main bedroom. And there, they walked back over to Billy, and just to make sure he was dead, the killer drew a knife and slit Billy's throat ear to ear. Then the killer walked out of the bedroom and met Jamie at the front door. Jamie gave his gun back to the killer and then ran outside to vomit. And that was it. The intruders got back in their car and sped off. They were in and out of the house in less than 3 minutes, leaving behind 2 dead bodies and a baby who would grow up without parents. But the killer was satisfied with what they had done. At least now his daughter, Janelle, would be safe. Buddy Potter, Janelle's father, killed Billy and Billie Jean. But police did not believe he was the one who actually set the murders in motion, or that he was the one pretending to be the mysterious CIA agent, Chris. Still, police easily had enough evidence to arrest Buddy, and they hoped that once they had him in custody, he would confirm that somebody else had pushed him to kill. But Buddy owned dozens of guns, and he often carried them no matter what he was doing, whether he was mowing the grass or out at a restaurant, he was always carrying. So when Agent Lott and Chief Deputy Woodard drove out to the Potter house early on a mid-February morning to arrest Buddy, they called ahead to let Buddy know they were just coming by with some follow-up questions. The last thing the 2 detectives wanted was to surprise Buddy and accidentally trigger an armed standoff. When they got there, Buddy let the 2 detectives into the house, but the moment Lott told him they were actually there to arrest him for murder, Buddy reached for a gun. But Lott and Woodard were ready, and they instantly tackled Buddy, pinning his arms and getting him into handcuffs. Then they dragged him outside, put him in the cruiser, and went back to the sheriff's office. On the ride, the detectives told Buddy they knew that he loved his family and he was just trying to protect them. He was no monster. After all, Buddy didn't kill the baby. The detectives reassured Buddy that they understood. The world was going to hell, and sometimes violence was the only solution, right? After all, someone else had warned Buddy his daughter was in danger. And with that, tears began to well up in Buddy's eyes in the backseat of the cruiser, and his voice cracked as he shared with the detectives all the terrible things the CIA agent Chris had told him that Billy and Billie Jean were going to do to his daughter. And it was just too much for him. He had to act. Now, while Buddy clearly missed all the red flags in the emails coming from the CIA agent Chris that clearly indicated he was not who he said he was, the state prosecutor, Dennis Brooks, who reviewed all those emails, he caught the red flags, and it was one particular red flag, a chronic error that popped up in many of the emails, that ultimately led Brooks to discover the fake CIA agent's true identity. Time and again in these emails, Chris made a spelling mistake that was far more typical for a school child than an adult CIA agent. Chris always forgot to drop the letter E from the end of verbs when he added the letters ing to them. So words like loving, taking, and caring all contained the extra E in the middle. And that was the same error that Brooks had seen over and over again when reading emails sent from another person, Janelle Potter. And so Brooks told investigators that Chris had been a figment of Janelle's imagination all along, but one that she had used to very effectively manipulate her entire family. Janelle had basically catfished her own family into believing that she was in mortal danger, and ultimately, that caused her father to go out and kill Billy and Billie Jean. A year and a half later, Buddy Potter, Janelle's father, was found guilty of killing Billy and Billie Jean and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. As for Jamie Curd, the star prosecution witness, he agreed to a plea deal that required him to serve 25 years in prison. Janelle and her mother Barbara went on trial for their roles in promoting the double murder. Janelle's attorney argued that she was too childlike to murder anyone, and she shouldn't be punished because her father was overly protective. But the jury was not buying it, and ultimately she and her mother were both sentenced to life in prison. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts: Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So, that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
In 1979, at a hospital in Alabama, a neurologist hustled down the hallway and turned left into a particular room. Inside was a female patient who was lying on her back on a bed with her legs propped up on pillows. Before she could ask the doctor what was going on, he just said, "Show me your hands." Puzzled, the woman did as she was told, and the neurologist lifted them up to look at them closely, and at some point, he saw it. And when he did, without saying anything, he just dropped her hands, turned around, and rushed right back out into the hall. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please replace the Amazon Music follow button's Sleepy Time tea with a tall cup of Black Label coffee from Devil Mountain Coffee Company. Okay, let's get into today's story. On an early evening in December of 1982, in the small town of Keene, New Hampshire, 35-year-old John Homan opened the door to Friendly's restaurant. At the welcoming sound of the bell over the door that announced his presence, the waitress, standing behind the service counter opposite him, smiled. Because John, with his flannel shirt, wide grin, bald head, and thick mustache, was one of this restaurant's most frequent customers, sometimes stopping by for 2 meals in a single day. But she also knew that the food at this Friendly's, which was basic American plus really good ice cream, was not the main attraction for John. As John had once explained to her, it was the location of this particular Friendly's that was perfect. The cheerful brick and white building with its bright red logo was exactly halfway between the office where John's wife Robbie had worked and the office where John worked as a machinist, making small metal parts for a company called Findings Incorporated. The couple had first discovered this restaurant 2 years ago when they had moved from the sunny South to chilly New England. Ever since then, the little restaurant had become their favorite place to meet after work, where they could eat a leisurely dinner together. Afterward, they'd both hop in the only car they owned and make the 20-minute drive to their little home in Marlow, a town to the north that was even smaller than Keene. Now, as John took off his hat and said hello to the smiling waitress standing in front of him, her order pad at the ready, those bright early days of his marriage felt so far away they could have belonged to someone else. Because just 18 months after their arrival in Marlow, John's beloved wife, Robbie, had died of a rare blood disorder. Immediately following Robbie's death, John had returned to Friendly's because it reminded him of his late wife. Now, a few weeks later, he was there for a different reason. John had found the one person in the whole world who could understand and share his grief over Robbie's death. One of Robbie's last requests had been to her sister, Terry, who lived in Texas. That's where Robbie had been when she died, staying with Terry while getting medical treatment at a highly regarded hospital in the Lone Star State. What John did not know when Robbie had packed her bags and headed west to see Terry was that Robbie had already made the decision that if she died, she would donate her body to the Medical Texas Research Institute. And when Robbie's treatment did in fact fail, just before Robbie passed, she had asked Terry to travel to New Hampshire, explain Robbie's decision to John, and then do whatever Terry could to help John get through what Robbie knew would be a devastating loss. And now, just a few weeks into Terry's visit, John's grief had not only lifted, he had felt a new sense of hope and possibility. Now, he was a regular at Friendly's because he wanted to share this special place with Robbie's sister. And tonight in particular, John was there because he was planning a special little surprise for Terry. But when John explained to the waitress that he was there to buy burgers to go for himself and Terry, and then to wait in their favorite booth for Terry to join him before they headed home, the woman's smile faded, and in its place, John saw a look that he was starting to recognize among his friends and acquaintances. It was a look of such obvious disapproval that it was impossible for John not to notice. And not only did John know exactly what people were thinking, he also couldn't blame them for the raised eyebrows. Less than 1 week after Robbie's death, and John had invited his dead wife's twin sister to move in with him, and now the two of them could be seen walking around Keene holding hands and tilting their heads back as they laughed and shared memories of Robbie. But while John understood why this waitress might feel shocked at the speed of John's apparent recovery from his broken heart, for John, Robbie's death didn't feel as sudden as it must have felt for everyone else in town. John had always known that Robbie was sick. Almost as soon as they had met in a bar in Florida a little more than 2 years ago, she had told him about the illness that caused periodic bouts of excruciating pain. And during the last few months that Robbie had spent in New Hampshire before leaving for Texas that past summer, the pain had become so bad that it was hard for Robbie just to get out of bed in the morning. John also knew that death affected him differently than it did most people. Ever since he was 16 years old and his mother had died, death had always been sudden, and grief was something you never showed or talked about. He could still remember his father walking into his bedroom just hours after his mother had passed away and saying to him, "Get up and get dressed, your mother is dead." And less than a decade later, John's father died too, leaving John to take care of his 5 younger siblings, the youngest of whom was only 15 years old. Those experiences had taught John that the only way to live with death was to keep moving forward, no matter what. So when Robbie died, and Terry flew out to New Hampshire to grieve with him, that impulse to keep moving, now with Terry, felt both natural and logical. So John ignored the disapproval written all over the waitress's face. He ordered dinner for himself and Terry, he paid the bill, and then, with a bag of hot food in his hand, he headed to the same booth he always sat in with Robbie. As he dropped down onto the padded bench, John instinctively reached up and began patting his coat, trying to find the package he had hidden inside one of his pockets. Once he felt it, he smiled to himself, and then he settled down to wait for Terry while she ran a few errands before she joined him. And then, just a few minutes later, John heard the little bell on the door jingle again, and when he looked up, he saw Terry walking into the restaurant. As always, just the sight of her made John's heart beat faster. Terry was a woman of average height and build, but she had an air of energy around her that had always made her stand out, even back when she was a child. And now, as an adult, especially in a small town like Keene, that captivating energy, coupled with Terry's carefully highlighted blonde hair, along with her neat and polished appearance, just added to her air of sophistication. As Terry stepped over to where John was now standing and waiting for her, the expression in his eyes told her how proud he felt that she was there to meet him. But Terry saw something else in John's eyes too, something that made her feel a deep connection to him. Both of them had just shared the same loss, the death of John's wife and Terry's twin sister, Robbie. Looking at John now, Terry could see the vulnerability and hurt behind John's smile, and Terry knew that losing Robbie was not the first of John's losses. Over the weeks they had spent together, John had told Terry about his parents' deaths and about how suddenly he had had to shoulder the responsibility of raising his younger brothers and sisters. Terry had experienced many of her own losses in life too, but unlike John, Terry just didn't feel ready to share tragedies, at least not yet. John's grief over Robbie was still very raw, and Robbie's instructions to Terry had been clear. Robbie had wanted Terry to go to New Hampshire to comfort John, and for John and Terry to help one another move forward. But Robbie's final wish couldn't stop Terry from thinking about her own past, especially when she was in a restaurant where families and children gathered for treats like milkshakes and sundaes. Because Terry herself had once had that kind of a family. A husband named Frank and 2 children, a son named Mike and a daughter named Carol, and a nice house and a nice car. Except then, Frank had died, and his death had changed everything. What had looked in the beginning like a viral infection had turned out to be a chronic liver malfunction, and by the time Frank was admitted to the hospital, it was too late. Frank's sudden death had left Terry alone to raise their 2 kids and care for her elderly mother on little more than what Terry could earn working as a secretary. Those had been very bad years for Terry, and she wasn't proud of how she'd handled things. But now, standing a world away from Alabama and those painful memories, Terry reminded herself that, like so many other women who were left alone in the world, she had done what she had to do in order to get by. And once Terry's mother had died, and Terry had become estranged from her son and daughter, it had felt easier for Terry to just leave her hometown of Anniston, hoping that the physical distance could dull the ache of these painful memories. Still, Terry knew that keeping secrets was not a solid foundation for a happy relationship. So she told herself that one day she would tell John about that dark period in her life. But as she looked at him now, sitting there in the booth he used to share with Robbie, Terry knew today would not be that day. After all, it had only been a month since Terry and John had driven to the local newspaper to file the information for Robbie's obituary. Terry could still remember John standing at the reception desk. Usually these details were delivered by the funeral home that was handling the service and burial, except in this case, Robbie's body had been donated to science, and so there would be no funeral or memorial service. As John did his best to explain these confusing circumstances, Terry could see he was close to tears. Taking a step closer to him, she tucked her arm inside of his. John's love for Robbie was one of the things that Terry liked most about John, and it was also one of the things that had convinced Terry that she wanted to stay in Marlow with John. After approving the final draft of Robbie's obituary, John and Terry had spent the rest of that day visiting Robbie's favorite places in Marlow where she had lived, and in Keene where she and John had both worked. For Terry, it had been thrilling to experience in person all of these different things that Robbie had written about in her letters to Terry. But not everyone Terry saw that day seemed happy about meeting her. In the late afternoon, when Terry had walked into the company in Keene, where Robbie had worked as a customer service representative, Terry's appearance was greeted with shock. In her letters to Terry, Robbie had said how much she enjoyed working at Central Screw, a manufacturing company that produced screws for other companies like car makers Ford and Chrysler. So Terry had been very excited to meet this group of other women, mostly secretaries, who had probably talked with Robbie every day. But when Robbie's old colleagues looked up from their typewriters and saw Terry standing there, looking so much like a woman whose death they had only just been informed about, they were more panic-stricken than welcoming. One of them even started crying. Terry pretended not to notice how obviously uncomfortable it was for people to see her there. Instead, she just turned to John and, with a smile on her face, told him she was ready to leave. But the truth was, Terry understood why the women were upset. As children and teenagers, Terry and Robbie had looked even more alike. But even now, as adults, despite the fact that Terry was much thinner than Robbie had been, and their hair was no longer the same color, Terry knew the similarities could be startling, especially to people who didn't know Terry well enough to see the differences between the sisters in terms of their temperament and habits and personality. Luckily for Terry, John had come to know those differences, and Terry's physical resemblance to her sister no longer surprised him or made him feel uneasy. But even though John had adopted the same habit of gift-giving with Terry that he had first established with Robbie, there was never any doubt that, to him, the sisters were very different people who liked different things. And sure enough, before Terry had even reached the booth where John was now standing, he was already pulling a small brown bag out of his pocket. At the same time, he picked the bag of burgers up off the table behind him and waved to the waitress to let her know that he and Terry would be leaving. As Terry opened the bag that John had handed her, she smiled. If there was one thing that Terry loved to do, it was read romantic suspense novels. As she looked down at the man and woman pictured on the cover, Terry understood that John was giving her two gifts, not just the book, but a chance to take her dinner home with her right now so she could settle into her favorite chair in front of the fire in their small living room and start reading. As the couple stepped out of the restaurant into the snowy winter evening, John wrapped an arm around Terry's waist and headed across the parking lot to John's white Ford pickup truck. A minute later, the two of them drove north through the small city of Keene to John's one-bedroom cabin in Marlow. To Terry, it didn't matter that John's cabin, which overlooked a small pond, was so remote, and that they had no phone and very little in the way of furniture. Because when John and Terry got settled into their chairs in front of their wood-burning stove, it felt to both of them that they had absolutely everything they could ever want. But even though both John and Terry knew that not everyone approved of their relationship, they had no idea that the local rumor mill was about to kick into high gear. To some residents of Marlow, it just seemed creepy that no sooner had John Homan lost his wife that he was living with her twin sister. But to Robbie's former co-workers at Central Screw, the gossip about John and Terry had an even sharper edge. Because, unknown to John, everything about his wife Robbie had always caused a lot of talk and speculation, and that included the circumstances of her sudden death. And while Robbie may have told her sister Terry that Robbie got along great with most of her co-workers, the truth was more complicated. While most of Robbie's male colleagues found her very charming and attractive, many of the women that Robbie worked with did not like her at all. To them, it seemed like Robbie used her good looks and charisma to manipulate men, just as her stories about her life and her past seemed exaggerated and mostly intended to impress other people. As a result, at least to the secretarial pool at Central Screw, anything having to do with Robbie was met with intense skepticism. So when Terry had walked into their office on her first day in Keene, looking almost exactly like Robbie, wearing Robbie's favorite ski jacket and smiling just one day after they'd been told that Robbie died, red flags started waving in every direction. Robbie's former co-workers couldn't explain why, but some of the women became convinced that something was not quite right about Robbie's sister, Terry. Like her sister, Robbie, Terry was like a puzzle they couldn't stop trying to solve. And for a small group of co-workers, finding out more about these two sisters had become a mini obsession. So, shortly after meeting Terry, a group of these obsessed secretaries decided to do some detective work on their own. Together, they dug through the back issues of the local newspaper and pulled out a copy of Robbie's obituary. Starting at the top, Robbie's former co-workers began fact-checking each and every piece of information listed in the 100 words that sketched the picture of Robbie's life. They looked up telephone numbers and addresses and double-checked the spelling of names, Then they started calling hospitals and dispatchers and journalists in Dallas and Houston and Tyler, Texas. And what these women found quickly turned their speculations and curiosity into outright shock. But instead of confronting Terry about what they discovered, the secretaries took their findings to the police. Keene might be a small town with a small town police force where officers had a close relationship with the people they served and protected. But even so, the Keene police were skeptical at first about a complaint that seemed largely based on office gossip and possibly an inaccurate death notice. But when Keene police took a closer look at the hard facts that women at Central Screw had uncovered, very soon they were forced to agree. There was something suspicious about Robbie's death and about Robbie's sister, Terry Martin. So, using the information from Robbie's coworkers as a starting point, police began digging deeper into the two sisters' backstories. And by January 12th of 1983, just 2.5 months after Terry had first arrived in New Hampshire, law enforcement would learn much more about the secret tragedies that Terry had been hiding from her lover, John Homan. The investigation that started in the Keene Police Department first went all the way back to 1974. That was about 7 years before Terry met John, when Terry was living in the small town of Anniston, Alabama, with her husband Frank and their 2 kids. That year, Terry's family would be hit with a series of terrible illnesses. 44-year-old Frank Hilly was the first member of the family to get sick. Frank and Terry had been high school sweethearts, but over the course of their nearly 25-year marriage, Frank had slowly withdrawn from Terry, spending most of his emotional energy worrying about money. Despite the fact that Frank had a good job working as a foreman at a local manufacturing plant, and Terry brought in some money working as a secretary, the couple still never seemed able to make enough money to keep up with their expenses. And as Terry confided to friends, while Frank had no problem spending most of his evenings down at the local Elks social club, where he would drink and gamble with other men late into the night, if Terry so much as bought a new dress from the local department store, Frank would behave as though she were single-handedly driving their family into financial ruin. But even Frank's constant worrying, drinking, and gambling didn't explain the slow and terrible deterioration in Frank's health that Terry would see between 1974 and 1975. At first, Frank suffered occasional stomach pains and nausea, but as time went on, he was experiencing severe bouts of vomiting, diarrhea, dizziness, and even hallucinations. Terry encouraged Frank to see a doctor, but Frank insisted he was just having some stomach trouble. But by the spring of 1975, Frank's condition had worsened to the point where his skin had become yellow and he was in constant pain, and finally he took Terry's advice and went to the hospital. It didn't take doctors long to figure out what was wrong with him. Frank had a chronic liver disease called infectious hepatitis, and under normal circumstances, this would have been a very treatable illness. But Frank had waited too long before getting medical help. So by May 25th, less than a month after going to consult a doctor, 45-year-old Frank Hilly was dead. Even though Frank had been sick for weeks, no one in his family expected that he would actually die. And for Terry, that shock was quickly followed by a second shock. Before she'd even had time to process the fact that her husband was dead, she found out that Frank had left her with thousands and thousands of dollars in debt. So even though Terry was going to be receiving $30,000 from Frank's life insurance policy, by the time every credit card and loan was settled, there would only be a little bit of money left to help Terry and her 2 kids, 22-year-old Mike and 15-year-old Carol, move on with their lives. And it would turn out this was only the beginning of an even bigger wave of tragedy that would hit Terry's family over the next few years. Soon after Frank's death, Terry's mother, Lucille, started to suffer from symptoms that were similar to the ones that Frank had experienced in the weeks leading up to his death. This time, though, Terry insisted they go see a doctor right away. But instead of finding an illness that could be treated, doctors delivered a much more devastating diagnosis. Terry's mother had terminal cancer. Over the next year and a half, when Terry was not working, she would spend every spare moment she could with her mother, Lucille, as well as with her kids, Mike and Carol. But by the time Lucille finally died in January of 1977, less than 2 years after Frank, all the insurance money was gone, the family was completely dependent on Terry's small salary as a secretary, and Terry's younger child, Carol, was entering a very rebellious and difficult adolescence. And just when Terry thought her life could not get any worse, it would turn out that the real nightmare was only beginning. As Terry would soon tell Anniston police, she and her kids had become the victims of a series of unexplained and bizarre occurrences inside of their house. In fact, these incidents had begun happening while Frank was still alive, but Terry had been so distracted that at first she didn't even notice. It started with a series of strange phone calls where the phone would ring and Terry would answer, but then the caller would either hang up or they would stay on the line but just breathe heavily and not say a word. Then, things started going missing from inside the house. They were things that were noticeable but not really valuable, like a hairdryer or a flower pot. The kind of things that would send a message to the homeowner that someone had been inside the house when the owner was away. At one point, there were also a couple of small fires, both at Terry's house and at the house of her next-door neighbor. The police would come out to investigate, even putting a trace on Terry's phone to find out where these calls were coming from. But as Terry would tell the police when they checked back with her, it was like whoever was making these calls knew the police had gotten involved, because as soon as police put the trace on her line, the call stopped. But just when Terry felt like her luck was finally improving, her stalker struck again. During the summer of 1978, Terry and her teenage daughter Carol had moved in with Frank's mother, Carrie. By then, Terry's son Mike had moved out of the house and headed off to Pompano Beach in southern Florida. Barely able to afford the mortgage on the home that she had shared with Frank, Carrie's offer of a place to stay was the first good news Terry had had since her husband had died. Until, that is, the telephone calls started again at Carrie's place. And Carrie and Terry both began to notice irregularities. An object here or there was missing, and there were nights when they'd come home to find the lights in the house had been turned on when they were very sure they'd turned them off. And there was more sickness. Before the end of that year, Terry's mother-in-law, Carrie, like Terry's own mother, Lucille, was diagnosed with cancer, and once again, Terry was called upon to look after a very sick relative. And then, a year after that, in April of 1979, something even worse happened. Terry's 19-year-old daughter, Carol, who had always been the picture of good health, also got sick. In the beginning, Carol herself waved off her bouts of illness as a series of bad reactions to something she had eaten or drank. But when these symptoms persisted, they reminded Terry so much of Frank's illness that she immediately dragged her daughter in to see a doctor. But Carol's doctor quickly determined that Carol was not suffering from hepatitis, the illness that killed her father. However, none of the tests or scans or examinations performed at the hospital could determine what was making Carol sick. So Terry took Carol to another hospital, and then another hospital, and then another hospital. But none of the doctors at any of these hospitals could figure out what was causing Carol's symptoms. And those symptoms just kept getting worse. Over the next 6 months, Terry would watch as her daughter's body began to deteriorate right before her eyes. Carol was in constant pain, she had lost so much weight that she looked like a skeleton, and then Carol started losing the feeling in her hands and feet. By September of 1979, Carol could barely use her hands at all, and she was practically paralyzed below the knees. And it seemed like whatever mysterious illness was working its way through Carol's body, it would likely kill her before the end of the year. On top of everything else, while Carrie was at home dying of cancer, Terry had been arrested. With the bills piling up and no money coming in, Terry had written some bad checks, and in early October, the police had put her in jail for 3 days. Meanwhile, Carol was alone in the hospital, unable to walk or dress herself, afraid that she was going to die, and nobody could even tell her what was wrong with her. Except that all that would change on the night of October 3rd, 1979. That's when one of Carol's doctors, a newly hired young neurologist, was sitting in his office puzzling over a list of Carol's symptoms and all the tests that had been run on her during the last 6 months. And as he turned the pages of her thick medical file on top of his polished mahogany desk, he suddenly went completely still. Short of an extremely rare neurological disease, there was one much more common thing that could be causing Carol's symptoms. And if this doctor's suspicion was correct, his next phone call would have to be to the Anniston Police Department. But before he made that call, he would need to examine Carol one more time. Walking out of his office in University Hospital in Birmingham, the neurologist quickly marched down the long hospital corridor and then turned left into Carol's room. A moment later, the neurologist was standing next to Carol's bed. When he asked Carol to hold her hands out for him to examine, she barely had the strength to lift her arms up off the bed. Very gently, the neurologist took Carol's hands and lifted them right up to his eyes so he could look at her fingernails. And immediately, the doctor found what he was looking for. Running across every single one of Carol's fingernails were what medical journals describe as Aldrich-Meese lines, which are horizontal bands of white discoloration. And these Aldrich-Meese lines provided proof positive that what was happening to Carol, and in all likelihood what had happened to her father, Frank, was neither accidental or natural. The reason nobody had been able to identify Carol's illness was because she didn't have one. Instead, Carol was being slowly and systematically poisoned, and the agent that was killing her was arsenic, the only poison capable of causing both Carol's physical deterioration and those telltale lines across each of her fingernail. After completing his inspection, the neurologist helped Carol lower her arms and hands back down to her sides. He watched as she closed her eyes, exhausted by the effort. Then, turning quickly to head back to his office, the doctor could only hope that he had made this discovery in time to save Carol's life. But even before alerting Carol's other doctors, the first thing the neurologist did when he reached his desk was pick up the phone and call the police. And by the time that call had ended, Anniston detectives were already scrambling to stop the person who was trying to murder Carol Hilley and to follow up on their suspicion that maybe her father's death was not due to natural causes after all. Days later, Frank Hilley's body would be exhumed and tested for arsenic poisoning. And by the end of that same month, the police had determined, beyond any doubt, that the same person who had tried to kill Carol had also succeeded in killing her father, Frank. 3 years later, and 1,700 miles to the north, police in Keene, New Hampshire were opening the next chapter in the story that had begun back in the late 1970s in Anniston, Alabama. And Keene investigators would soon find out that the same person who had been a suspect in the murder and attempted murder of Frank and Carol, respectively, had also been intimately and closely involved in the lives of two people who had only recently moved to the little town of Marlow, New Hampshire, Robbie Homan and her sister, Terry Martin. Working together, police in Anniston, Alabama, and in Keene, New Hampshire, along with agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, would eventually piece together a story of murder and deceit so unbelievable that it would be talked about long after all the headlines had faded from the local newspapers. According to evidence gathered in that investigation, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Frank Hilley and his daughter Carol, and to John's late wife, Robbie. Frank Hilley's murder actually began months before his actual death. That's when his killer began to lace his food and drink with arsenic, first a little bit in his coffee, then when the killer grew impatient, mixing the poison in his food and drink in greater and greater quantities. By the time Terry had visited Frank in the hospital, pressing his wasted hand between her warm palms, it was too late. Even if the doctors had known what was wrong with Frank, they would not have been able to reverse the damage that the arsenic had done to his internal organs. But the killer would have a much harder time killing Carol. Carol was young and healthy, and as she too began to ingest arsenic in her food, the resulting bouts of nausea and dizziness and stomach pain would result in Terry sending Carol repeatedly back to the hospital. Still, the murderer was not worried. Over time, they had become an expert at poisoning their victims. Children's deaths could be made to look like sudden viral infections. The deaths of older people could be chalked up to ill health and cancer, with a side helping of poison to speed death along. While in the hospital, Carol had plenty of visitors, just as she did at home. and it was easy for her would-be killer to offer Carol treats of food brought in from outside the hospital, and even injections of a vitamin mixture, which, they promised, would help to lessen Carol's suffering. And it wasn't until the young neurologist discovered that Carol was being poisoned, and police and doctors together took a hard look at Carol's list of visitors and began limiting all access to Carol, that Carol's killer knew two things. They had missed their last opportunity to complete this particular murder, and it was only a matter of days before police uncovered their identity. And the killer was right on both counts. On October 25th, 1979, about 20 days after Frank's body was exhumed for testing, Anniston police formally charged the killer in the death of Frank and the attempted murder of Carol. But then, 1 month later, the killer was released on bail, and after a short stay in a local motel room, the killer vanished, leaving behind a trail of emotional destruction and a charge of first-degree murder. The killer's disappearance was discovered on November 18th, the same day that Terry's mother-in-law, Carrie, died of cancer. 3 months later, the killer surfaced again, but this time the killer was going by a new name, Robbie Hannon. And once Robbie Hannon met the unassuming and trusting John Homan at a bar down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida in November of 1979, Robbie would have what she believed was the perfect cover that would allow her to begin a whole new life. A new husband who would take her to live far away in a tiny town in New Hampshire where Robbie was sure she would never be found. But in August of 1982, Robbie had decided she was ready for one more fresh start in life. That's when Robbie announced to John that she was leaving for Texas, where she could stay with her beloved twin sister, Terry, while Robbie received treatment for her rare and mysterious blood disorder. But Robbie would not return to New Hampshire because in November of 1982, 3 months after leaving for treatment, John would get a call from Terry notifying him of Robbie's death. Terry would then fly to New Hampshire to comfort John, and not long after that, Terry would decide that she wanted to stay in New Hampshire and build a life there with John. But just 2 months into that life, the local police in Keene, New Hampshire had already opened an investigation into Terry. After receiving that tip from the secretaries at Central Screw, the Keene police discovered some major inconsistencies with the story Terry was telling about her sister Robbie's death. In fact, after reviewing Robbie's obituary, they found that none of the information mentioned in the notice was true in any way. To police, it was obvious that Robbie's sister, Terry, who had provided the details in that obituary, was hiding something, and that something might have to do with Robbie's death. So, on a cold evening in the middle of January 1983, just after Terry got off work, investigators pulled up in an unmarked black sedan right outside the small publishing company where Terry had recently found employment. When Terry saw the car and the men inside, her face lost all expression. She turned to say goodbye to a waiting friend, and then, without a word or objection, Terry waited while officers opened the back door of the sedan, and then Terry slipped inside. When officers immediately began to pepper her with questions, Terry just closed her eyes and put up her slender hand and said, "Please, can we at least wait until we get to the police station?" Meanwhile, just before 5 p.m. that same evening, John Homan was sitting in his usual place at Friendly's, waiting for Terry, when one of the waitresses told him he had a phone call. A minute later, John handed the phone back to the curious waitress, his face now as white as a sheet. Once in the parking lot, John climbed into his pickup truck, he fired up the engine, and then with a squeal of tires, he headed toward the police station. As soon as John stepped through the door from the parking lot into the precinct, he was met by a detective in a coat and tie who instructed John to follow him into a small room. Gesturing at the table and chairs, the detective asked John to please take a seat. A moment later, and John was glad he was sitting down, because the very first line in the story that this detective was about to tell him knocked John's entire life completely out of balance. It would turn out that Terry Martin was not Robbie's twin sister. It would also turn out that Robbie did not have a twin sister, and Robbie never had a rare blood disease. But as shocking as that was, it was not nearly as shocking as the revelation that came next. It would turn out that the two most important women in John Homan's life, Robbie and Terry, were actually the same person.
And the real name of that woman, known first to John as his wife Robbie, and then as his new lover Terry, was Audrey Marie Hilly. And Audrey Marie Hilly, who just went by Marie, was wanted by police in Anniston, Alabama, on a charge of first-degree murder for the death of her husband Frank and for the attempted murder of her daughter Carol. When Marie, aka Terry, had seen the unmarked black police car pull up to the curb outside of her place of work that afternoon, she knew she had finally reached the end of a very long road with no place left for her to hide. And when police had escorted Marie, aka Terry, into the interrogation room in Brattleboro, she would immediately confess to the litany of crimes and deception that would later shock the entire country. It would turn out that when Marie was living in Anniston with Frank, she had an insatiable need for money. While Frank may have spent a few dollars on gambling and drinks with his friends, it was Marie, not Frank, who was the instrument of the family's financial destruction. With her unending purchases of expensive clothes and cosmetics, and even the purchase of a car, Marie had taken out multiple loans and opened multiple credit cards, often using the good credit of various family members to secure these loans that she could not pay back. When she realized that Frank simply did not have the money to bail them out, Marie took out a life insurance policy on him and then began administering arsenic in his coffee and food until he sickened and died. And when Frank's life insurance ran out, Marie took out policies on her two kids, Mike and Carol. All the reports Marie made to family and friends about being the target of those mysterious and threatening phone calls and minor thefts were actually just aimed at trying to ensnare and control her children and convince Mike that she needed him close to protect her and Carol. But Mike had been dealing with his mother's deceptions his whole life, so he simply told Marie to take her story about the mysterious stalker to the police while he moved away to start his own life. With Mike gone, the threats to Marie's safety stopped, and the threats to Carol's safety began ramping up as Marie turned her fatal attention from her son to her 19-year-old daughter. Once Marie's campaign of poisoning Carol had resulted in Carol's hospitalization, it was easy for Marie to keep Carol from getting well by lacing the food that Marie brought to her with arsenic and by injecting Carol with arsenic in the form of those shots containing the so-called special mixture of vitamins. But before Marie was able to give Carol one final injection of arsenic, the injection that likely would have killed her, the police intercepted Marie at the hospital. By that time, Marie's checks to cover Carol's life insurance policy had begun to bounce, and police were able to arrest Marie immediately for passing bad checks, a charge that would soon be followed by charges of murder and attempted murder. But by the time police had all the evidence they needed to convict her for murder, Marie was out on bail, and she felt the net closing around her, and so she slipped out of her motel room and skipped town. And for the next 3 years, Marie would escape capture by assuming a variety of false identities, including her star turns as Robbie Homan and Robbie's completely made-up sister, Terry Martin. And although Marie would only be charged in the death of Frank Hilly, investigators in Anniston were convinced that she had actually committed enough murders to qualify as a serial killer. After Marie fled from Anniston, Alabama, autopsies were performed on the bodies of Marie's mother, Lucille, and her mother-in-law, Carrie, and those autopsies revealed that both women showed signs of arsenic poisoning, and it may have been that arsenic poisoning that caused the cancer that ultimately killed them. On January 19, 1983, 1 week after her true identity had been revealed and she was taken into custody, authorities transported Marie back to Anniston, Alabama to face trial. And 5 months later, on June 8, 1983, despite her claim that she had never poisoned anyone, Marie was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But there would be one more final twist in the unbelievable story of Marie's life. Despite everything that her husband John would come to know about Marie, his devotion to her never wavered. When Marie was transported to Tutwiler Prison in Wetumpka, Alabama, John packed up his life in New Hampshire and moved into a hotel in Anniston so he could see her during the prison's weekly visiting hours. Within a few years of her incarceration, Marie's good behavior had earned her the privilege of unsupervised weekend furlough passes.
And on Thursday, February 19th, 1987, John picked her up at the prison with the plan of spending an entire weekend together. 2 days later, on the morning of Sunday, February 21st, the day she was scheduled to go back to Tutwiler, Marie got dressed and told John that she was going to make a quick trip by herself to the nearby cemetery so she could visit the graves of her parents. And that was the last time that John would ever see the woman of his dreams. Instead of coming back to meet John as planned for breakfast, Marie had made one last attempt to start over. But this time, Marie wasn't heading into an unknown future. She had decided to return to her long-ago past. On February 26th, after having been missing for 4 days, police would get a call from a woman who lived in a house not far from the rural neighborhood in northern Anniston where Marie had grown up. The caller reported a woman, filthy and shivering from the cold, slumped over the railing of the woman's porch. When police arrived minutes later, they found Marie, barely conscious but still alive. The detective called an ambulance, and Marie was rushed to the hospital. But it would be too late. Marie had been suffering from intense hypothermia, and on her way to the hospital, she had a heart attack and died. She was 53 years old. On February 28, 1987, Audrey Marie Hilley was buried in Anniston, Alabama, in a plot next to her first husband and murder victim, Frank Tilley. Her funeral was attended not only by John Homan, but by Mike and Carol Hilley, her 2 children that she had planned to kill. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please replace the Amazon Music follow button's Sleepy Time tea with a tall cup of Black Label coffee from Devil Mountain Coffee Company. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the Mr. Ballin Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballin.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallin, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see you.